members already. That's great.
Yeah, I'm comparing my attendance list to the participant list to see, make sure everybody's coming in.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know, Susan, I don't know if you've heard of any last minute cancellations, but I have not.
No, nor have I.
And you know, when we're discussing a live streaming these hearings and things, Susan, where you are today, your hair is not purple, so I would just point that out.
Well, we'll see how long I last here. I don't have as good reception here as I do where my hair is purple. So if my hair turns purple later, you'll know I had to move my laptop to another room.
Hey, I like the purple hair, Susan. I have no problem with the purple hair.
Oh, okay. It's just that room is like really dark, and all my stuff is where I am now. So I much prefer where I am. But yeah, purple hair is good. That's the silver lining of that location.
And I see that Purvi broke the broke the seal here, and so anybody who is an AIA member or APA member, please put your member numbers into the chat like Purvi just did. Thank you, Purvi. And as I believe this is 6 credit hours for AIA. Is it the same for the others? I assume. Yes. So just put your information in there, and they will take care of it for you.
I want to get my credits. It's hard to get them right now.
Oh my, absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Well, we have lots of opportunities, and I just want to mention that since you're all attending camp, if it's your first time, and we'll probably mention this again throughout the day, you get a free 1-year membership to NAPC. We have a bunch of webinars coming up that are free to members, and you get continuing education credits from that too. So. But it'll please allow like 10 days for them to actually show up in AIA. But I got writing it down.
Yes, perfect. I need my credits too. We can't go to conventions now, right? So you can't get them.
No. I know I got some last summer from going to like a couple of online conferences, but yeah. It's been tougher, especially since I don't work in an architecture firm, right? So it's not like there's lunch and learns or whatever that I can go to.
I miss lunch. I miss lunch and learns.
Yeah, although I do have one client who invites me to them, so that's nice.
That's good.
So I get them that way. The lead ones are harder, I think.
Oh yeah, definitely. All right, should we get started?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. So welcome everybody. Thank you everyone for coming. We're very excited about this. This has been a long time in the works, and I think it's going to be a great couple of days here. This is the first one. Next one is next week, and we will at the end of the day today we'll give some more details on that, just so everyone doesn't forget. Like I said, I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank all of our board members and all of our citizens from all the various groups who are here today. This should be fun. Please, keep it interesting, keep it entertaining. I think we're going to have this is a great group that's doing the training today. So just a couple of ground rules. So this is a general training for historic preservation. What I mean by that is that that there can be no specific business of the BAR discussed during any of these training sessions. All discussions should be kept general in nature. If you have any specific questions about any cases or other businesses, please let me know, and we will get you in touch with trainers if that's what you need. But please don't bring them up during the actual discussion. The discussion today and the next hearing are being videotaped. They're being live streamed and they're being taped. They can be available after the hearing if you'd like to look at them. So with that, I will stop talking and I will turn it over to Karen and her team. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. My name is Karen Gordon, and I'd like to introduce my fellow trainers before we start. As I go through the introduction, one of the last slides will be our agenda, but I did want to introduce the trainers first. And information about us should be on your agenda, so I will be very brief. I am the former and happily retired Historic Preservation Officer for the City of Seattle. And previous to that, I did live in Washington, D.C., where I was involved with Don't Tear It Down, now the D.C. Preservation League. So I'm very familiar with Alexandria and happy to be with you, if not in person, virtually. Joining me is my fellow Washingtonian, Lauren Hoop-Kamer, who is the Assistant Historic Preservation Officer for the City of Tacoma. Adam Lovelady, who's an Assistant Professor of Public Law and Government, excuse me, at the School of Government at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And Michelle McCullough is the Historic Preservation Officer for the City of Winston-Salem and Forsyth County in North Carolina. So I wanted to give you a very brief introduction about the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions and the CAMP process. But first, to let you know that, as you can see on the screen, that this training qualifies for continuing education credits. And the instructions for getting those credits is up on the screen. Put your name and member number in the chat box. And then you are responsible for self-reporting to either APA, AICP. And certificates of completion will be available upon request. We are going to have a specific time at each session for questions and answers. So use the raise hand or chat feature, and we will get to those questions at our presentation. So this is the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. The purpose really is, as you see on the tagline, to bring building strong local preservation programs through education, training, and advocacy. In terms of education, the Alliance produces the Alliance Review, which is a quarterly publication, which has an incredible amount of very valuable information for commission members and staff and people in your community. And by the way, as part of this training, each of you will receive a one-year membership in NAPC, so you will have access to the Alliance Review, and the next is our NAPCL, our discussion group, which is an excellent resource for asking a lot of the questions we're going to talk about today and having a good interactive conversation with your peers around the country. Excuse me, advocacy. NAPC serves as a voice for your commission in Washington, D.C., and as an advocate at all levels of government. The other thing we do, which you are doing right now, is training. So we do CAMP, the Commission Assistance and Mentoring Program. And we have, through the very able assistance of Marie Snyder, who's on the call right now, our staff person gone totally virtual in the last year and are just beginning to plan some in-person camps. But CAMP is generally led by qualified preservation professionals in support of the local preservation commission. And we have worked with your staff to put together an agenda that we believe will really suit some of the needs of the commission in Alexandria. We also have the NAPC Forum, which is every other year, and it provides training sessions, tours, and expertise of nationally recognized speakers, excuse me, in preservation. The Forum 2020 topics, which again was held virtually, had a variety of issues: advocacy and engagement, diverse and underrepresented resources, community resiliency, methods and materials, and broadening our horizons. The forums are a good size, but not big enough that you can't really, that you're able to participate, which is something that you should really take into consideration in going to a forum. It's a relatively intimate setting in person compared to other large conferences, so I really encourage it. The next forum will take place in Cincinnati in 2022. So with that, I want to go over the agenda for today very quickly. I'm now doing the introduction. Lauren and I are going to share the Why Preserve section. And then Adam is going to do a presentation after a break on legal basics, followed by Michelle, who's going to talk about standards and guidelines for design review. Just a reminder, our second session will be next Thursday on the 20th, and it will be from 4 to 7 p.m. And it will also be done remotely. And between now and then, we have a little homework assignment that I'm going to talk about at about 12:15 this afternoon, or for me and Lauren, 9:15, because we're up with the roosters in my neighborhood. So without further ado, I'm going to get out of this PowerPoint and cross my fingers that I can get back into my next one and begin the preservation overview. I know that for some of you, this might be a little repetitious, but I think that it's been helpful in a number of camps to really go over just the history of the preservation movement so that people have some perspective. So I always say it's like the history of the world in 45 minutes. And since I'm sharing it with Lauren this time, it's going to be the history of the world in 30 minutes before I turn it over to her. So I am going to hopefully get into that.
Yes, and while Karen is switching, sorry, I'm going to go on mute in a second. I'm going to launch, that's bad timing, 2 polls.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Marie, I meant to say that. Go ahead. So Marie is muted for a second, but she's going to launch 2 polls that we'd ask you to fill out while I'm putting my PowerPoint up.
All right, so I just shared the results if anyone is interested. All right, Karen, you're almost there. And I'm going to launch the second poll, and that'll be it. And then Karen can start her presentation.
Got it? Is it up there?
Yes, here's poll number 2. So this is for the BAR members. Looks like we have some experienced people so far. All right. I'm going to give it till, all right, I'm going to go ahead and end. You're good to go.
Okay, thank you. All right. And we're a minute ahead of time. Excellent. So I know that many of you know this, but I want to give you, like I said, the very briefest of overviews. As I say, the history of the world in 30 minutes. So I'm having trouble going forward. Oh, there we go.
Just click on your.
No, I got it. I got it. So I'm not pandering to the local crowd with Mount Vernon and Monticello. It's my opening slide all the time. I promise you. But it is where I usually start in making this presentation, because the modern quote unquote preservation movement really did begin with the battles or the efforts to save really two of the most iconic properties in the country. One is Mount Vernon, of course, which is literally a stone's throw away from you, and the other is Monticello, which is a longer drive. I've done that in traffic. It's not pretty coming from Alexandria. So there were, before Mount Vernon and Monticello, other efforts to save historic buildings around the country. Many of them were successful, others were not. Most notably is probably when the state of Pennsylvania wanted to demolish what we now know as Independence Hall, and the city of Philadelphia jumped in to save it. As I said, there were other examples around the country that were generally efforts led by a local community, but none really had the gravitas of a Mount Vernon. George Washington, of course, was, the most venerated leader in the very young United States. And when he died in 1799, his estate passed on to one of his nephews. Of course, we know that he had no children of his own, so it went to one of his nephews, who then continued to pass it down. In 1846, one of his nephews offered to sell the property to the federal government for $100,000, which was about $3 million in 1846. The US Army tried to purchase the property in 1851, and by that time, the asking price had gone up to $200,000, or almost $6 million. So that was pretty much a no-starter. At that point, the state of Virginia came in and tried to broker a purchase, but that was unsuccessful. And it really wasn't until the efforts of a woman by the name of Anne Pamela Cunningham from South Carolina, who, the story was on the boat on the Potomac and saw this deteriorating property, and essentially put together what is probably one of the first and grassroots organizations in the country to save a historic building. And it was very much directed to, quote unquote, the ladies of the South, although it ultimately became a national effort and included people from across the country. She was joined by the famous orator, the former Massachusetts Senator Edward Everett, who really went around the country raising money to purchase the property. So by 1859, through these state chapters and other public requests, the money was secured. But because of the Civil War, the work went on for a number of years. And it was only in the late 1870s, and after Cunningham had retired from the organization in 1874, that the property was purchased by the funds that were raised. The next, of course, was Monticello, which had just as dramatic a history, but not as national an audience. And when Thomas Jefferson died, the property passed to his daughter Martha, who, because of debts, had to sell the property. So Jefferson died in 1826. Martha Randolph sold the property in 1834 to a man by the name of Uriah Levy, who had been a lieutenant in the Navy, very wealthy, had inherited money, made money, no one's quite sure. And he actually made an effort to find some of the furnishings that had been at Mount Vernon and really to bring the property back to what he believed it had been during Jefferson's time. He was a real fan. And he lived there until his death in 1862, which of course was during the Civil War. His young wife and his brothers and sisters and their children were in a protracted legal battle over his will, because in his will, he had left different properties to different people, but he had left Monticello to the people of the United States. And his siblings and nephews and nieces took this to court. And basically, the federal government didn't know how to approach even acquiring a property. And a judge ultimately ruled that the heirs, his siblings, were able to own the property. And during the litigation, one of his nephews, Jefferson, Levy had basically bought out the interests of his cousins and his aunts and uncles and lived in the Monticello beginning in 1881 until his death in 1924. And there wasn't really an issue in terms of the disposition of Monticello until a woman by the name of Maud Littleton, who ironically in everything you read about her is always referred to as Mrs. Martin Littleton. I literally had to look up her first name because that's all she's referred to in texts of historic preservation, was the wife of a congressman from New York, and she thought the government should own Monticello as Jefferson's home. And she began a public campaign, somewhat on the level of Anne Pamela Cunningham, not through chapters, but really a national effort. And that too, because of that too was not successful over a period of time because government was reluctant to purchase the property. Ultimately, they raised enough money. She was assisted by William Jennings Bryan when he was Secretary of State. And Jefferson Levy, I think as he was getting older, ultimately agreed to sell Monticello for $500,000, which would be about $10 million in 2021 dollars. And in 1923, the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation, which was really composed of wealthy New York business people, was formed and ultimately raised that money and purchased the property in 1924, which was essentially a year after Jefferson Levy died, purchased it from his estate. So besides the obvious need for good estate planning by our founding fathers, both of these are really very good examples of how the private preservation movement and the continuing reluctance of government to either accept or purchase historic properties. So I think that gives you somewhat of an overview of kind of where we're starting and really what the public's perception of preservation was. There were, of course, other efforts that were going on at the same time. Historic New England was formed by William Sumner Appleton. It was originally called the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. And of course, wisely, in the last 20 years or so, changed its name. And there were a lot of other preservation and educational organizations that were formed over this period of time. Of course, Colonial Williamsburg, which was established by John D. Rockefeller in 1926. So, you see this continuum from 1853 when the Mount Vernon Ladies Association was formed. The Daughters of the American Revolution became very involved in preservation efforts, especially in Monticello, the Colonial Dames, Historic New England, really culminating in Colonial Williamsburg in 1926. I often contrast that to what we see in the public sector when and this is not on a slide, but just as for a context for people, that the Supreme Court ruling on Euclid versus Ambler, which really established historic preservation as a legitimate use of the police power, was decided in 1926. So there is that parallel in terms of private preservation efforts, then really the public, the state becoming more involved. And so I want to talk a little bit about the public preservation efforts. Really begins in the Antiquities Act of 1906, which gives the president the authority by presidential proclamation to create national monuments from federal lands to protect significant natural, cultural, or scientific features. Of course, we often see that at the end of almost every presidential term when presidents either use the Antiquities Act to declare a site or an area historic, and some others take that designation away. No other comments. So other public preservation efforts, again, this continuum in the National Park Service was formed in 1916, the Historic American Building Survey and the Historic American Engineering Record in 1931, and the Historic Sites Act in 1935. So you really see in this period of time more public involvement, really more in the planning process and documentation. The National Trust for Historic Preservation was chartered by Congress in 1949. Again, not government, a private effort or a private nonprofit effort to support preservation of America's diverse buildings. And then really culminating in the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. This is not the signing of the Historic Preservation Act. This is the signing of the Medicare Act. But when you search for stock photos of presidential signings, shockingly, there's no photo of the 66 Act being signed. So I had my choice of the Civil Rights Act or the Medicare Act, and I thought this would probably be more plausible in terms of a representative photo. But you know, in its time, it was a bold effort. So what does the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 do? It expanded the National Register of Historic Places, which we know was created in 1949. It created the Section 106 and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and it created the State Historic Preservation Offices to administer the National Register, to do review and compliance for 106, survey and inventory, planning. Everyone has a state preservation plan, grants, federal rehabilitation tax credits, public education and technical assistance. So what is Section 106? It created the Advisory Council, and it basically said any federal undertaking should not have an adverse effect on historic properties. And it required that determinations of eligibility for listing in the National Register and determinations of effect of the federal undertaking and mitigation of any adverse effect. Also, in a year prior to the 66 Act, very important, the Department of Transportation Act of 1965 established Section 4F of the Transportation Act, which is, as many of you who've worked in preservation for a while know, is much more rigorous standard than Section 106. It states that a special effort must be made just to preserve the natural beauty of the countryside and public park and recreation lands, wildlife and waterfall, and historic sites. We can maybe talk offline or in chats about some of the effects of Section 4F, but it is by far, for those of us who have been practicing preservationists, one of the strongest tools to save historic properties. The 1980 amendments to the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 created the Certified Local Government Program, which required that every state do a 10% pass-through of its federal appropriation to local governments, that National Register nominations are reviewed by local officials and the Local Preservation Commission. It allowed an owner objection to listing in the National Register of Historic Places. And I should note that is only for private property, owners of public property, states, local governments, colleges, et cetera, that are state or local institutions cannot object to listing in the National Register. It also established tribal historic preservation officers, which was something that really had been overlooked by the National Preservation Program. So here again is that continuum from the Antiquities Act in 1906 really through 1966, a very short period of time saw the growth of the preservation ethic in the federal government. Federal, state, and local preservation laws intersect at a number of levels. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to leave the slide up. You'll have this available to you. And again, your staff is pretty familiar with all of these issues, and I'm happy to answer questions as well. Early preservation efforts, again, not pandering to the locals, because I usually have my Alexandria slide. That's right, you should applaud. Alexandria, Savannah, San Antonio, Charleston, Washington, D.C. Were all places that really understood preservation as a really valuable land use tool, frankly, in their communities. And those are really some of the earliest efforts for local preservation districts, and still remain today very important districts in terms of, again, that continuum of preservation. As we move into the 60s and 70s, you see the slide on the left really is what's left of Penn Station in New York, which really galvanized really the preservation movement around the country. And really began a lot of local jurisdictions, not a Savannah or Alexandria or Charleston, to put together historic preservation ordinances. I put the other slide in, Celebration 76, because one of the suggestions of things people could do in 1976 for the bicentennial was to form a historic district commission. And when I travel around the country doing camps or talking to people in other communities, I find a lot of commissions were chartered by their city government in 1976 or 77. And it was because it was really one of the things that people put on the list of things you could do to celebrate the bicentennial. So that really does account for a number of the commissions around the country, some of which have been dormant over the years, but nevertheless still there. And finally, preservation in the 80s and 90s. We talked about the 1980 amendments to the Preservation Act of 66, and that really did create in a very meaningful way many more commissions. So where we are right now is there are more than 2,000 certified local governments. You have 36 in the state of Virginia. I should note that not every preservation commission is a CLG, but many of them are. And I ended my presentation here, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Lauren, because preservation really has evolved a lot, and we're talking about issues now that we didn't talk about for a long time, and Lauren really is on the cutting edge of having those discussions. So I am delighted to turn that over to her, and at the end of her presentation, we will get to any of the questions in the chat room. So I will go out of this share and turn it over to Lauren.
Hello, everyone. I'm just gonna pull up my presentation here. So my name is Lauren Hookhamer, and I'm the Assistant Historic Preservation Officer for City of Tacoma, which is on Puyallup tribal land. And then I'll play a quick video that is a land acknowledgement.
Ati duf ati swatwiftud atis poyalapaj, a slasasil, alti disha tu alturi tuha.
It is the land right here that the Puyallup people have lived on since the beginning.
This
right here is where we are in the world, our homelands.
We work on our ancestral lands. We raise our children who go to school on the land of the Puyallup people.
We acknowledge that the Medicine Creek Treaty was signed for the whites to take our land for their benefit.
Land was assigned to our people. The Caucasians said, "This is your land," and they took that land from us too. Our land was stolen from us. Treaties were broken.
But we are still here today.
Our people forage for food and materials, we pick berries, we canoe, we practice our traditional ways, and we speak Twelshutsi.
Just as our ancestors did. We are finished.
All right, so I played that video. Oh, sorry. There we go. Sorry, just switching over. Presentation. There we go. Slides back up. So I played that video to start because, as Karen said, I'll be talking about emerging trends and new frontiers for historic preservation. And I think one of the newest trends is really respecting local knowledge. You know, as historic preservationists, we sometimes see ourselves as the experts on history or the gatekeepers. And what we really should do is be bringing in those other voices and those other stories, acknowledging the people who are there, acknowledging the community that's doing the work. So I really encourage everyone to, you know, find out who are the community organizations in your group, who's been making history, who's been making stories, who's talking about, you know, civil rights. All of that is very important. So along with that is the Beyond Integrity movement. So what that means is that oftentimes sites are not landmarked because of integrity issues. And the sites that have the most integrity issues are usually associated with underrepresented communities. And a lot of that is because they didn't have access to, you know, high style architecture. Their properties were more vernacular. They didn't have property ownership, perhaps. And they didn't have, you know, well-known architects building their buildings. And so Beyond Integrity is really a movement that started in King County here by Seattle and Tacoma area. And it's really about looking beyond just the architecture and the architectural significance of a place as a threshold. This is something that I think many commissions are going to have to start grappling with, because many codes use architectural integrity as a threshold, and they use it as you know, as a yardstick for how you do design review. So we really have to start thinking about, how do we preserve sites that are significant for their cultural significance? You know, sites of women's history, sites of LGBTQ history, sites of civil rights, sites of local movements that are not technically architecturally sound. So along with that, we're starting to really recognize layers of history and conflicting identities. When we did the Beyond Integrity Task Force, one of the things we did was survey all of the landmarks on the King County register and see how many of them were associated with underrepresented communities. And no surprise, very few of them were, even if they had that significance. Sites that were, they often were instead landmarked for their architectural significance. We also see something that's really common is that when you landmark a home, you'll have it'll be the man's name, and it will not include the wife. So something in Tacoma is we have been getting a lot more landmark nominations that include the wife's name. So, you know, Mary and John House, which I think is really, really important. Also, we have to come to terms with conflicting identities. And I think that's something that's very difficult, especially if you're in a place that has some controversial history that maybe, you know, you're no longer proud of. There might be some Confederate history, there might be some, you know, Chinese expulsion history, and being able to tell those conflicting stories and how the significance has changed over time is something we really need to start looking at. So this is an example from Boyle Heights in Los Angeles. It's the Wyronwood Garden Apartments, and they have been fighting to be landmarked for over 10 years now. When I got into the profession, this was my first internship, and they are still fighting this fight. And what's going on here is that this is a 1920s garden apartments building, but developers want to, you know, demolish it so that they can do some housing, because Boyle Heights is one of those communities that's really becoming more trendy and being gentrified. This site has also been the home of Latino immigrants for decades. They have built really a community here. They have their own celebrations, they have their own festivals, generations come back and they live here, and they really have this sense of identity. And so they are really trying to landmark it based on its more recent history and not on that architectural merit. So difficult history. This is an example from Tacoma. We had a mid-century neighborhood, more affluent, a lot of views, and they wanted to landmark their neighborhood. One reason was the views, which is not something that historic preservation protects, but they were also a very intact mid-century planned neighborhood. And I love mid-century modern. So they were proposed as a conservation district. They passed through the Landmarks Commission and the Planning Commission and were turned down by City Council because on the books were racially exclusive covenants. Now, of course, they weren't being enforced, but it did say in the text of the neighborhood, if you go back and look at their original charter, that it was supposed to be no people of color who were not day workers, right? And no people of color could be owners or live in these homes. And when they went to present this to City Council, the granddaughter or great granddaughter of the architect came and she really, she said, we really want to preserve my grandfather's vision. And that really rubbed people the wrong way because his vision really was very racist, and they hadn't really dealt with, you know, coming to terms with that racial history, coming to terms with what that meant. And they kind of just said, well, that's not something we do anymore. So what resulted from this was actually the state changed the law so that racially exclusive covenants could be removed without a full vote of the community. And, you know, it's strange to think that that would have held people back. There are some communities who wouldn't have had 100% voting to get those off the books. And so as we start to move into the mid-century landmarking, we're going to see issues of redlining. We're going to see these types of problems coming up. Sustainability is also something, you know, really big for us. I think it's been long been said, you know, the building that's built is the greenest building, and the National Trust put out the greenest building documentary, and that was all about reducing the waste stream. But I think it's a lot more than that. So this is a picture that I used in my thesis about managing cruise ship tourism, because I think as we start to travel more, as the world, you know, becomes smaller, we're seeing massive amounts of tourists, right, flocking to historic cities because we all know why they're great, right? And we know why people enjoy visiting them. And cruise ships, hopefully cruise ships will be a little bit on the decline now, you know, with everything going on in the world, but cruise ships bring, you know, hundreds of people at one time. And the infrastructure of these cities is just not built for that sort of influx. So Venice is seeing a lot of trouble from just the amount of people coming through the infrastructure, as well as environmental issues like the cruise ships are eroding the coast, the smog, you know, the waste that cruise ships put into the water has really been detrimental to cities like this. And so I think sustainability, we can think about it in a larger scope, just from just preserving the building, but how do we do environmental preservation as well? And how does that affect the historic environment of the communities that we live in? Along with this is the issue of how does tourism affect the local history and culture of a place? For example, places like the Bahamas, Falmouth, Jamaica, are really seeing sort of a commercialization of their community and culture because they have become cities that cater to what tourists, and usually white or Western tourists, want when they go there. So they're no longer perpetuating, you know, some of their more traditional products or foods or cultures, because everything's become commercialized and targeted for these tourists. And so that is what I have for now, and I will be presenting again on their second day, and I'll be talking a little bit more there about reaching your audience, diversifying your audience, and other issues of equity and inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. We actually are running a little bit ahead of schedule, which is a first. And so I wanted to know if people had any questions, if you either wanted to use the chat function, raise hand. We're certainly open to that. Any questions, comments, observations? Okay, well, if that is the case, we will break a little bit early. We were going to do a break from 10 to 10:15, but we'll do the break from 9:45 to 10. And Adam, you've gotten 15 more minutes.
I'll see what I can do to fill it in.
Oh, I'm sure on legal basics you can fill it for 15 minutes.
I'm sure exactly what they're hoping is we want more law. We want to talk more about procedures. So
everyone always wants to hear from the lawyers.
Can I also jump in real quick? We typically, after the break, do a camp photo. So I just take a screenshot of the group. If you'd rather not participate, you can turn your camera off. It's just become a little camp tradition that's kind of fun. And while you're on the break, you can do a little primping in the bathroom or something. And we just share it on our Facebook page. So just a warning while you're on the break when we come back.
Okay, so we will come back at 10 a.m., 7 a.m. for me and Lauren.
Karen, do you know if Christine Roberts was able to get back into the room? Oh, you muted.
He was.
Okay,
She's
great.
in.
Thank you.
Marie just let her in. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I didn't even realize that people could send a message from the waiting room, so that's good to know.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. It's Zoom is an ever evolving platform.
All right, it's nice to see some faces popping up. I'm going to give it maybe 1 more minute for anyone who would like to join in this fun camp tradition.
I like that everyone did the exact same thing. Everyone turns their camera on, immediately fixes their hair, and then sits up straight.
Yeah, it's just like an instinct now.
I've been watching everyone do it. It's been fun to watch it as it rolls through. And John took off his glasses, which, I don't know, John.
All right. Give it about 30 more seconds. And I'll give you a count to 3 so you can be warned. And thank you all for participating. I'm not turning my camera on because I don't want to appear in every single one of these pictures. So
I don't know, Marie. It's kind of like the Carmen Sandiego thing.
I know. I like
finding you at each camp photo.
Yeah, I'm like, where's Waldo? That's what I like to say.
Okay.
All right. Someone just came in, so feel free to turn your camera on if you would like to join in this camp group photo that I'm going to take in 10 seconds. All right. And I count to 3. 1, 2, 3, smile. All right, thank you. Carry on.
Okay, thank you very much. We are now going to go to Adam's presentation, and he will talk until 11, and we're going to take then about a 2-minute break after that, and then Michelle will make her presentation. So Adam, it's all yours.
All right, Karen, thank you. And thanks to Lauren also for kicking us off this morning. It is great to be with you all, even virtually. There's lots of things that are lost for not being together in person. I wish we could be together in person, but I'm so glad that we have this alternative. Also, there's the little silver linings of virtual camp, right? So just now I went up, I'm in my basement in Chapel Hill, went upstairs to get a fresh cup of coffee and got to see the version of Starry Night that my 5-year-old is working on, right? So something that would not have happened if I was in Alexandria for a couple of days. So I hope that you also get some little random kind of joy today as we're at home or office or whatever, but not gathered in some building in downtown Alexandria. So I'm going to talk about legal basics. As we go through, I want to emphasize that I welcome your questions. You can add them to the chat box. You can raise your hand. You can just take yourself off mute and interrupt me. I'm glad for you to do any and all of those. I will also give the caveat that there's lots of really good and important questions in law, and oftentimes there's not a great answer, and especially if it's somebody coming in from the outside. And so I want you to ask your questions, and I want to prepare you for me not knowing the answer to it. Now, let me go ahead and pull up my screen so that I can share this, and I'll see if I can get a thumbs up from somebody if you are seeing slides, legal basics. All right, thank you very much. So just to give you a little sense of me and who I am, I actually started my career I did my undergrad at Auburn University in Alabama, and then spent a year working in historic preservation. I was working in Asheville and Shelby, North Carolina, doing National Register nominations and tax credit applications, doing some research to try to get an old theater listed and revitalized as part of a Main Street program. So I did a year, kind of my first professional work was a year in historic preservation research. And then I myself went to teach. Taught second grade with Teach for America. I was based in Atlanta, and it was the hardest job I will ever have. It was also the most rewarding job I will ever have. It was an amazing experience working with second graders on the west side of Atlanta. Amazing kids who are now like adults and have their own kids, which is crazy to think. After that 2 years stint teaching, I myself went back to school and did a dual degree in urban planning and law at UVA, and then was working with McGuire Woods in Richmond for several years, working with both local governments and developers, with utilities and builders and nonprofits, all across, mostly across the East Coast, but some of them operating across the U.S. and across the world. After several years with McGuire Woods, I had the opportunity to move here to Chapel Hill, and for the last 9 years, I've been here as first, how does it go? Assistant, now associate professor, working at the School of Government. And the School of Government is a bit of a unique place. We do have a Master's of Public Administration program, but much of our work, and almost all of my work, is outwardly focused, working with local governments around North Carolina on the kind of legal and policy decisions that they make. And I've got colleagues that work on all kinds of topics, tax policy and elections law, and kind of the whole range of local government matters. I focus on development regulations, zoning and land subdivision and historic preservation, and the legal framework for what communities in North Carolina can and can't do. So I get to work with folks just like you, planning staff and planning boards, elected officials and preservation commissions around North Carolina that are doing the hard work of helping their communities grow, trying to guide their community's future. So I know the hard work that you do, and I want to start off with a thank you for the thankless work that you do, whether you are on the architectural review, let's see what Virginia has the specific name, the Board of Architectural Review, or your staff, or you're otherwise interested in your community. It's hard work and it's thankless work. And you are the folks that are willing to show up on Friday morning, on a beautiful spring morning, to listen to a preservation law discussion. So thank you for the hard work that you're doing and for giving your time to your community. Now, this is my necessary disclaimer. I am an attorney. I graduated from UVA. I have my Virginia law license is kind of on the secondary status. I forget the name of it, but I've looked at the Virginia laws. I've looked at your local ordinances. I've researched things. So I've got some sense of kind of the legal framework in Virginia of preservation. And I'm coming in as an outsider. And at the end of the day, some of the really tough questions you'll need to check with your city attorney's office on. Some of the tough questions you'll need to make, you'll need to weigh the pros and cons, and there will be gray areas. I'm not pretending to have all the answers for Virginia law and for how things ought to be done in Alexandria, but I've got a general framework of it. And so there may well be things that I'll say, it's a great question, and you should check with the city attorney's office on that. Not only because I don't have the answer, but also at the end of the day, they're going to be the ones that need to defend the decisions that you make. And so I definitely want to defer to their expertise and their knowledge on these very important matters. So all of that is kind of lead up to what I'm actually here to talk about, the content of this session. And what I want to go through is these 4 topics. First off, just, is this legal? We've got, I mean, we're all doing this preservation stuff. There's a whole national association, this Alliance of Preservation Commissions. So we sure hope this stuff is legal, but how and why and what is the basis of the legality of telling the private property owners what their property can look like? What is the foundation of limiting development on private property through public regulations? I want to first talk about that. Then I want to circle back around to touch again on some of the stuff that Karen talked about, some of the federal level statutes and requirements, and how that affects private property, how that affects your local program. Then I want to spend most of my time on the state and local preservation laws, because that's really what you're in the business of doing. As we'll discuss, the federal rules are all about federal actions, and it's the local rules that really matter for your work as a local preservation commission, as a local board of architectural review. And then finally, I want to touch on some of the open governance rules for Virginia, the extent to which board members, you know, if three or more of you are gathered and chatting about that next case, well, it's a public meeting, and it has to be noticed as such. If you're chatting by email or text or sending mail back and forth, for whoever does that anymore, if you are communicating and creating records, whether electronic or otherwise, about your work, you're creating public records, and that would be subject to disclosure. And there's lots of good reasons we have those rules. I'm glad that we have open governance, and we need to be aware of what those rules are and act appropriately. So that's what I'm going to try to get through here in the next 49 minutes that I've got left on the ticking clock. So track back in time, we now have kind of just this inherited knowledge and presumptions about the legality of historic preservation rules. But rewind to a time before preservation is just kind of accepted, and suppose that you have as a starting point constitutional rights of citizens and private property owners, that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And so we have as a foundational starting point that there's some limits on the ways that public regulation can limit my rights as a private property owner. And so, you know, I own a historic home or a historic site, and the government comes and tells me whether or not I can paint my house purple. The government comes and tells me whether or not I can develop on my property. The government comes up with these rules about what fits or doesn't fit, and sets up this board that says whether the changes I propose for my private property, this board is going to tell me whether those are appropriate or not. Now, rewinding our framework a bit and reframing it a bit into thinking that way, it raises legitimate questions like, is there actually authority for the city of Alexandria to tell that private property owner they can't develop their property or they can't change their property in some way? What is the public purpose? Is there a requirement for some compensation for that? Is this a legitimate use of the public authority to regulate? How does it relate to our broader notions of kind of public health and safety, the reasons that we regulate other things? Well, this has been a topic of lots of litigation over the years. Some has been state level litigation, and the big case, the big federal case that came down, came out of a dispute in New York City, and it gave us the Penn Central case. But I think it's fun to have a little context for what this proposal was and how it played out. So it's named the Penn Central case because the company was the Penn Central Railroad Company, but it actually concerns Grand Central Station in New York, a place many of us have probably been, we're familiar with. And you can see there at the very bottom of the image, there's Grand Central Station right down there. The proposal was for a 50-story tower atop Grand Central Station. And we can, I think it's kind of somewhat amusing. I mean, part of the reason I put this picture up here is the like audacity of, we're going to put a 50-story tower on top of Grand Central Station. Are you crazy? It actually turns out when it was built in the 20s, Grand Central Station had columns. It was designed for a tower to be built atop it. I think it was originally like a 20-story tower intended, but it was designed with that in mind. Not only that, but you can see, like looking at this design, it's does this 1970s design, it does have a kind of maybe not mirror, but at least echoing the surrounding buildings. I guess that's the Seagrams or the Pan Am building or something in the background, and it does kind of echo the design there. And so it's not like outrageous, the notion of how it might fit in. And this is Manhattan we're talking about. This is a place where big buildings are built, right? And the reason that this dispute arises is property owner at the time, the Penn Central Railroad Station, Railroad Company, was proposing this 50-story tower. Grand Central Station had been identified and designated as a landmark in New York, along with some other landmarks in the city. And because of that, the owner had to get a certificate of appropriateness from the Preservation Commission there, the Landmarks Commission in New York City. Now, there was some allowance for transfer of development rights. And so there was some allowance for the owner of this property actually kind of sell off the development rights to other receiving properties in the area. But in any change that was going to be made to the property would have to obtain a certificate of appropriateness. So they went and they sought it. Just to give you to make you perhaps feel better or worse, I don't know, about the length of your hearings and the kind of level of detail in your hearings. They had 4 days of hearings for this matter. There was, according to the case report, there were 80 witnesses that testified for this case. Perhaps you have similar experiences in Alexandria, but you're either in good company or it'll make you feel a little better for the long but not quite as long hearings that you have. After those 4 days of hearings and 80 witnesses, the Preservation Commission turned down the proposal. They denied the certificate of appropriateness, and the property owner challenged it. They said, whoa, whoa, whoa. First off, this is not a valid use of the governmental powers. You telling us we can't, you kind of based on aesthetic concerns, based on some notion of the public value of historic preservation, that's not a legitimate reason for you to be regulating our property. If this was health and safety, if there was some threat of our tower falling over on our neighbor's property, that would be one thing. But you're just saying you don't like the way it looks, and that's not a legitimate use of the public power. They also said, you're taking our property. This is eminent domain. You are, for public purposes, taking all these air rights. We could have otherwise built 50 stories of office space, very valuable office space in Manhattan, and you have taken that from us. And so if you're going to do that, you owe us just compensation. Because remember, go back over here to the constitutional rights. No person shall be deprived of property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So the property owner said, look, first off, you don't have the rights to be regulated like this. It's not due process. And if you're going to regulate it like this, you're taking our property. You owe us just compensation. So that made its way to the US Supreme Court. Before that time, there was a question. Is this a legitimate use of the police powers? Is this a legitimate regulation, or does it require compensation? And of course, we know the end because we're still here talking about historic preservation. The court said, among other things, and this was a big case for lots of reasons, but the court said, among other things, this court has recognized in a number of settings that states and cities may enact land use restrictions and controls to enhance the quality of life by preserving the character and desirable aesthetic features of a city. It is a legitimate government purpose to preserve historic properties. It is a legitimate government purpose to preserve the character of a place. It is not a taking of property to limit what can be built there. Now, to be sure, regulation could go so far to amount to a taking. So if the city of Alexandria, if there were some vacant lots along the waterfront and the new regulation said, property owner, you can't build anything here because we like the views. That might amount to a taking. It might leave effectively no economic use of that property. But it's very rare these days that a regulation is going to leave no value to the property. Usually there is something the property owner can do. And in this particular case, for the Penn Central case, the court said, look, this is still Grand Central Station. It is still a major hub of transportation. There's still retail and office space within the building. This is still valuable land. It's not as if you have nothing you can do and nothing economic left in this property. It's just a regulation as to how much you can build there. And that's just basic zoning. And we said 50 years ago that zoning is fine. So with that, we then get an answer from, this is the late 70s, we get an answer from the US Supreme Court as to, is historic preservation regulation a legitimate regulation? Yes. Is it automatically a taking of property? No, it's a regulation like other regulations of property. Now, there have been subsequent state cases that have taken on additional elements of this and give refinement to this. There's also substantial state and federal cases around what are the procedures we have to follow? What are the ways that we have to make sure that we are affording due process of law to the private property owners as we're doing that? And I'll touch on that some today, and then we'll really dig into those kind of elements of due process in the next legal session on our time together next Thursday. All right, so is it legal? Yes, it is legal. There are limits, and we do have to be mindful of those limits, but it is a legitimate use of the governmental regulatory powers to regulate historic preservation or changes to preservation properties. Okay, so let me get a swig of water, and then we're going to switch to the federal preservation laws. Karen did a great job of walking through kind of the history of, there's lots of different federal aspects of preservation. I want to focus in on the ways in which the federal pieces apply to a property and the ways in which they matter or don't matter for a private property owner. So one of the big pieces is the National Register of Historic Places, right? Overseen by the Department of Interior and based on specific federal guidance, implemented through the state historic preservation offices, a long list of the notable places around the country that are worth preserving for a variety of preservation, architectural, and cultural reasons. Now, one of the big things to emphasize here is listing on the National Register of Historic Places, in contrast to local designation. When a property is listed on the National Register, that does not tell the private property owner what they can and can't do with their property. If my property is listed on the National Register, I could tear it down tomorrow. And the federal government's not going to stop me from doing that. I could paint the house purple. I could put a 50-story tower on top of it, as long as that met my local zoning rules, which in Chapel Hill, it would not. But supposing that I could meet the other rules, the National Register is not going to prevent me from putting a 50-story tower on top of my historic property. One thing the National Register does do, the listing in the National Register, it gives me access. If I'm going to be rehabilitating my historic property, it gives me access to those federal tax credits if it's an income producing property. The other thing that the listing in the National Register does is it protects me from certain federal actions. And so there's Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Section 4F of the Department of Transportation statutes, and the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA. Each of those three, they have important technical distinctions between them as to what's required and how much protection it is, but each of them has rules that say if there's a federal action of some kind, funding a big transportation project, issuing permits for certain private activities like impacting wetlands or putting up cell towers or other actions that require a federal permit. If there's some federal action, then that federal action has to take into account the impacts it may have on historic properties. Properties that are listed or eligible to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And so that listing on the National Register, it's not limiting me as a private property owner, it's limiting the federal government and the extent to which the federal government might impact my property that's listed on the National Register. Now, important to note, it's not perfect and it's not all-encompassing. And so it's for NEPA, for example, it's just a procedural requirement. It is a requirement to the federal actor. Hey, you need to take this into account. You need to have looked at the impacts and considered that in making the decision. It doesn't say you can't impact the property at all. And so it's not perfect. It doesn't mean that nothing will ever happen to a historic property based on federal action. Section 4F is more substantive and does have more protections against transportation projects impacting historic properties. So from a private property owner's perspective, the federal piece it's out there. It's given some protection. Maybe it gives me some access to maybe it gives me a little bit of access to some incentives, some tax credits. But really the piece that matters to me and the piece that matters for us today is the state and local rules. So let me shift to those. So thinking about the state authority, and this varies a bit from state to state, and I will confess I don't know all the details of Virginia's State Historic Preservation Office or how it's structured or the things that it's doing. But typically the State Historic Preservation Officer, the SHPO or SHPO, depending on how you want to shorten that, they're overseeing the National Register nominations from that state and helping to facilitate that process. They're overseeing the federal tax credit review. In some states, there is a state level register of historic places, and there are protections from state action. So in the same way that the federal limit federal actions impacting historic properties, in some states, there's a similar limitation on state level actors impacting federal property, or excuse me, historic property. And then the big thing that the states are doing are enabling local governments like Alexandria to put rules into place to establish local districts and to protect historic districts and landmarks from change, to require certificates of appropriateness when there's going to be a change on a private property. One of the things to note, and y'all may have heard before, and I'm sure you will hear again, and you're going to hear this morning, Virginia is a Dillon's Rule state. Virginia's courts have been clear that local governments in Virginia get to do what the state of Virginia has said, the Commonwealth of Virginia has said they can do. And an architectural review commission, as was noted in this case out of Danville 17 years back, an architectural review commission is a creature of statute possessing only those powers expressly conferred upon it. This is a contrast from some other states where there is more delegated power to the local governments, where there is more home rule for local governments to make the decisions that they see fit for them. In Virginia, the local government authority is very much prescribed by the state and limited by the state. So an important limitation to keep in mind, especially when you go to the forum in Cincinnati next year and you hear about this really amazing thing they're doing in Colorado or California or somewhere else. There may be some limitations on the extent to which that authority is available in Virginia. That doesn't mean you shouldn't pursue it. Doesn't mean you shouldn't ask the city attorney or your local delegation about it. But it does mean that there's it's a particular thing to keep in mind as you're thinking about what we can do as an architectural review commission. Now, kind of drawing out that distinction, thinking about that distinction between the federal level protections, the federal listing and designation, and the local designation. The National Register nominations and designation, that's going to be based on national criteria set the Department of Interior. And those nominations are going to go through the State Historic Preservation Office and to the Department of Interior for the decision making. Setting up local districts, setting up local landmarks, those are based on the local criteria, based on your ordinance, based on the statutes in Virginia and what they require for setting up a district and setting and identifying and designating landmarks. So they're based on different criteria. As mentioned, listing on the National Register, that's not limiting, it's not restricting what the property owner can do. Now, if they're rehabilitating and trying to get the federal tax credits, they have to meet certain standards and expectations, the Department of Interior standards or Secretary of Interior standards. But if they're not seeking those tax credits, there's very little limitation on the private actor. In contrast, when we're talking about local designation, those properties within your local district, those properties that have been designated as landmarks in your area, there are clear restrictions on the alterations and construction and demolition of that property. Those local rules set forth the standards for what can or cannot be done within the district and requires that the owner come to the Board of Architectural Review to get a certificate of appropriateness to make sure that this action is appropriate, fits within the district. Listing on the National Register, as I mentioned, it does give access to the federal tax incentives. There can be state level tax credits and there can be local level tax abatement. Again, those are details of the state and local law. It's going to depend on how it's structured and what authority has been granted. And then the National Register nomination is going to give protection from those federal actions. Local designation is not doing that. Local designation is setting forth the rules about what can or can't happen within this district and what approvals are necessary within this district. So clear distinction there between if a property is listed on the National Register or a property is listed in the local district or landmark. Now, to be sure, there's a lot of overlap. Oftentimes, the National Register district is also a local district, and so both of these rules would apply. But that's not necessarily the case, and you can have properties that are listed on one or the other rather than both. Now, I've already touched on on these a couple of times, but just thinking about those incentives that are in place for rehabilitation, for those contributing structures on the National Register, there can be access to the federal tax credits. And I'm now going to look around the virtual room because I'm forgetting whether Virginia has state level tax credits or not. Does Virginia have state level tax credits, or is it just local tax abatement that's available?
Yes, there's a residential credit similar to the federal tax credits, but you don't have to be an income producing property. And it's a 25% investment tax credit for certified rehabilitation.
Got it. So thank you, Al. So there is access to some state incentives. I will note in thinking about that, in thinking about advocacy for historic preservation, especially at the state level, those tax credits are not set in stone. And when budgets get tight and when a General Assembly is making adjustments, tax credits, especially for things like historic preservation, can be on the chopping block. Just a couple of years ago in North Carolina, the state level historic tax credits were allowed to sunset. And then there was a extended fight by both the agency actors as well as local preservation activists trying to resuscitate that state level tax credit. They've gotten some things back, but not back to the levels where they were. And so thinking about preservation advocacy, be careful sitting on your laurels thinking because we've got something now, we will always have it. Okay, So enough of me talking. It's now your turn to both think and talk. And if we were together in person, I would make you turn to your neighbor and talk. It's a little more challenging to do that in the virtual room. So what we're going to do is I'm going to read through this. We're going to have a minute of silence, and then we're going to chat about it. So what do you think? Jane owns property outside the local preservation district. Her property is part of a proposed National Register district. Jane loves history, but hates government regulation. She approached the chairperson of the local Historic Preservation Commission to discuss her concerns. You and your friends in Washington need to keep your thieving hands off my property, Jane said. You can't take my property and you can't tell me what color to paint my house, exclamation point. How would you advise a preservation official to respond? So 1 minute, I'm setting the timer now. Jot down some notes about how you would recommend the preservation official respond. All right. That is a minute. So I'm curious, what things did you come up with? What are some things that you, maybe this could be you responding to Jane's concerns? What would be your response?
I'll go. Everyone's quiet. I would tell Jane not to worry about it because as a National Register district, there would not be any regulations on what she can and cannot do to her house. So she can paint her house purple if she wants, and there's nothing that the National Register district could do to change that.
Yep.
The only thing I would add to Susan's is that I would explain to them some of the opportunities that are involved with being in the district where she is, and some of the opportunities of historic preservation, so that she doesn't think it's quite so onerous as she appears to think.
I always tell people how I didn't pay state taxes for 10 years because I did a certified rehabilitation in Virginia. That gets their interest.
I like it. Turn away from the sticks to the carrots.
I was wondering if staff planted this question because it came up in the mayoral debate this week, and the former mayor, despite all of the training and coaching and tours that we did for her, still believes that in Old Town, they tell you what color you can paint your shutters. She said that twice in the mayoral debate in response to a question about should Del Rey become a local historic district.
So I wish we were so coordinated that staff had planted this question. I will confess this is a version of the same question that I ask if I'm in Colorado or Oklahoma or North Carolina. I actually hesitated a little bit because usually Washington is way off. Usually when I'm asking this question, your friends in Washington are way off. Here, they're just across the Potomac. So it's a different context for your friends in Washington. Other thoughts or ways of responding to this? Well, I think you've touched on all the good stuff, right? How can we be clear about what applies and what doesn't apply? That distinction between the federal register nomination, national register nomination, and the local designation. The incentives that are available, the protections. One of the things that Jane clearly is concerned about, some federal actors doing something to her property. Well, being listed on the National Register actually protects her from, or gives her some protection from DOT putting a highway across her property, or making some other federal action that might impact her property. And so all of that is there. There's also, it's not really set up by this question, but one of the peculiar things that plays out oftentimes when we talk about local development regulations, whether it's zoning or preservation or anything else, folks are very confident in their ability to take care of their property. They are less confident in their neighbor's ability to take care of their property. And one of the things that may, that can be an incentive or a kind of rationale for zoning regulations, preservation regulations, or something else is to have a kind of an even playing field on what's expected of everybody, and making sure that kind of everybody is operating under the same expectations and the same regulations. Because, well, I'm not going to paint my house purple, but I don't know about my neighbor. And I keep saying paint my house purple. It's a absurd and kind of useful example. It's also perfectly appropriate for a preservation commission, for district guidelines, to not care about color at all. I'm just offering that as a bit of an absurd example.
And Adam, that was the irony of the mayor's comment the other night, because our BAR has not regulated paint color in over 30 years. For that very reason.
Yes, for very intentional reasons, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and I think there are very few that want to wander into the details of color. So there are some, and they have the authority for it. But all right, excellent. Thank you all for contributing, and let me move along a bit to think a little more about the kind of legal framework for your district, your board, and the kind of steps that you're taking. So looking at the purposes outlined in the ordinances for setting up your districts and landmarks, for establishing a BAR, you've got a lot to take on, right? Enriching the quality of life for city residents, protecting historical and cultural resources, improving property values and providing incentives for the upkeep, educating residents and visitors, identifying and protecting historic resources, nominating historic properties, assuring that new structures are in harmony, safeguarding the city's portion of the George Washington Memorial Parkway. That's a lot to take on. And some of that is going to be through regulation and through certificates of appropriate, but you can't accomplish all of that through just regulation. And so one of the things I want to emphasize and encourage is certificates of appropriateness are one piece of one thing you need to do, one tool in the toolbox, but you can't accomplish all of this with just regulation. It's going to take education. It's going to take outreach. It's going to take partnership. It's going to take incentives. You've got to use all the tools in the toolbox to accomplish this broad range of purposes. Thinking about the BAR composition, it's set forth in the ordinances that it's set up with 7 members. There is a requirement for the members to have a demonstrated knowledge of history and architecture and related fields, which is distinct from some other local boards that may just be open to anyone and everyone. The Preservation Commission, the BAR, the members have to have some demonstrated expertise and knowledge. Members do have to be residents of the city and have to have resided at least a year prior to joining the board. There is a preference there listed in the ordinance for owners of property within one of the districts or one of the 100-year-old properties within Alexandria. And then there's some specifics. There's got to be 1 member from the Old and Historic Alexandria district, 1 member from the Parker Gray district, 2 architects. And so there's some specific kind of seats and expertise that's required and needed. and it's set up for members to have 3-year terms. Now, to be sure, I want to reiterate, there's more than certificates of appropriateness, but that is one of the big and important pieces that you handle. As the ordinance states, no building or structure shall be erected, reconstructed, altered, or restored within the old and historic Alexandria district unless and until an application for a certificate of appropriateness shall have been approved by the Board of Architectural Review as to exterior architectural features, including signs which are subject to public view from a public street, way, or place. The property owners in your districts, if they're making changes to their property that's visible from the public right-of-way, they've got to come before you and convince you that change is appropriate, that it fits within the character of the district. Now, we'll talk some more next week about what that means and the burden that that puts on those property owners and the expectations that we have for due process. And I think one of the important things to keep in mind as you think about the rules that apply to you, as you think about the ways that you make your decisions, are how would you want to be treated if you are coming before a Board of Architectural Review trying to convince that board that a change is appropriate? What would be your expectations for what information you would have to provide, for the clarity of the standards, for what happens if you don't agree and you want to appeal? And that raises lots of important questions about due process and good governance. So important topics that we'll be turning to as we talk about due process and decision making next week. Now, the last thing I want to talk about briefly is open governance. And I kind of use that as a broad term for public meetings and public records. The rules for this, we oftentimes refer to FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, and the extent to which there are rules about what constitutes a meeting and what's required if it's public, what is a public record, and what is required for us with regard to public records. Now, this is one of those technical and detailed topics that is specific to Virginia state law and specific to the rules and procedures that have been adopted at your local level. So this is one of those topics, I'm going to talk about it in the general, but it's certainly an important one to be coordinating with city staff and especially with the city attorney's office on what the rules and requirements are. Especially these days, because a lot of the rules have been changing with regard to virtual meetings and what's required to go along with virtual meetings. So I'm going to talk about it in the general, but I would encourage you and recommend that you coordinate with city staff and especially the city attorney's office on these topics. I'll also say that, as evidenced by the outline, I'm coming down to the tail end of my presentation. I would love for you to add some questions into the chat box in case I wind up with enough time to handle some chat. Oh, and I see there's been chat happening, and I just was so busy talking away that I didn't even notice. So I've got that open now. All right, so first off, in thinking about open records, what the Virginia statutes say is that all writings and recordings, regardless of physical form or characteristics, prepared or owned by or in the possession of a public body or its officers, employees, or agents in a transaction of public business. Now, that's a long, lawyerly way to describe something, to be sure. But what it says is if you are conducting the public business and you are corresponding in some way that's creating a record, that's a public record. And if there's a public record, we've got to retain those records. There's specific timelines for how long those records have to be retained. And if there's a request for those public records, there will be an obligation to turn those records over to that person requesting. That person requesting may be the applicant who really didn't like the decision that you made. That person requesting may be the local paper who plans to run a story on the front page about your email exchange back and forth. The pieces of and requirements of open governance, the pieces and requirements of open records means that as we're doing our public work, we should presume and expect that what we're writing down might wind up on the front page of the paper. Now, that's a little maybe off-putting. It may make us a little nervous. It may make us a little uncomfortable. And that's a good thing. Take yourself out of the role of public official, take yourself out of the role of BAR member, and put yourself into your typical shoes as a citizen, as a community member. We want our public officials making good decisions, informed decisions, and decisions that are out in the open. We want our public officials to be doing their level best and grappling with the hard issues and making the tough decisions. And we want to make sure that they're doing that. We want it done out in the open, clear for us all to see, not backroom dealing, not a decision that's decided ahead of time with email or text exchange back and forth, and then everybody just shows up and it's kind of routine decision. We as members of the public, as citizens, as community members, we want to have access to the government that's overseeing us, and open governance and open records is a piece of that. So yes, it makes us a little uncomfortable that the email we send might wind up on the front page of the paper. It makes us a little, a little nervous that, would I say it wrong, or would this wind up being disclosed? We should have that nervousness because we're public officials making public decisions concerning folks' private property, and we need to be doing that out in the open with only the best of intentions. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here, and like I said, I don't know how the Virginia courts have interpreted this, but this is a pretty broad description and definition of open record or of public records. All writings and recordings, regardless of physical form or characteristics. So it doesn't matter if it's a hard copy letter or if it's an email. It doesn't matter if it's a text on your private phone. If it is transacting the public business, it's a public record. We had a case in North Carolina just a few years ago where there was a mayor was sending an email, and he specifically said in his email, "I'm sending this on my private email account so that it's not disclosed." Well, guess how I know that he sent that email? Because it was a public record and it was disclosed. And so just because it's on your private email account, just because it's on your private phone text, that doesn't change the nature of it being a record that's created in the course of transacting the public business. And so important considerations and good considerations. This is not intended to scare. It's not intended to cause you undue anxiety. It's intended for us to have sunshine kind of into the halls of government. Similarly, we have rules and requirements about open meetings. Open meetings defined in the Virginia statutes is when sitting physically or through electronic communication as a body or entity, or as an informal assemblage of as many as 3 members or a quorum, if less than 3, of the constituent membership, wherever held, with or without minutes being taken, whether or not votes are cast, or of any public body. Again, this is a long, broad, lawyerly way of defining what a meeting is, and it encompasses a lot. It doesn't matter if you are together physically or if it's electronic communication. It doesn't even matter if it's a Zoom meeting, kind of a video meeting, or it's kind of a same time text exchange. If you and 2 other members of the Board of Architectural Review are on a text string together, going back and forth at the same time, talking about the public business, it's a public meeting. And so you need to be very careful and mindful of to avoid those situations and to address them if they happen. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't go to the old Alexandria holiday party and chit chat with your fellow Board of Architectural Review members. But when that chit chat turns to that case that's coming up for the meeting next month, now it's a problem. It doesn't mean that you can't bump into your fellow board members at the grocery store and chat about kids sports leagues, or when can we take these masks off today, apparently, or whatever. You can certainly have those encounters that aren't related to your work as BAR members. But when the conversation turns to the work of the public body, then it's transitioned to a public meeting, and the rules for public meetings would trigger. So what are those rules for public meetings? If there are 3 or more BAR members discussing BAR business, that's a public meeting. If there's going to be a public meeting, there's got to be notice at least 3 working days prior to the meeting. It's got to be open to the public. There have to be minutes prepared for that meeting. And any information that's provided to the members must also be available to the public. Now, this does not mean you can't have meetings in different places or with different kind of configurations. It may be appropriate from time to time to have a site visit where multiple members of the BAR are going to be there and view the site and talk about it. You can do that. It's just going to be a public meeting, and you would need to treat it as such. It need to be open for the public. You'd have to be noticed and open for the public to be there. It does mean that if there's going to be simultaneous email exchange, kind of reply all email exchange is happening the night before the big meeting, that's effectively a public meeting and would have to be treated as such. So you need to send out notice 3 days ahead. Hey, we're going to have this really heated email exchange the night before, and here's the email. Everybody in the public has access to it. That, of course, is not going to happen. And so you need to not have those simultaneous email exchanges concerning the public business. All right. So y'all, that is a bit of a sprint through the legal basics. The big takeaways, I think, is this legal, regulating private property for historic preservation? It is, but we have to be really mindful of the due process considerations and really clear about what's expected and how decisions are made. There's federal rules about historic preservation, and largely those are about protecting properties from federal action and getting access to federal tax incentives. The local regulations are really where the action is happening. It's really the work that you're doing. It's authorized through the state, and that's where there are regulations about what folks can and can't do with their property. If they want to make a change to their property, they have to come to the BAR and get a certificate of appropriateness. And because the BAR is making public decisions, enforcing public regulations on private property, you're a public body and you need to be really mindful of the requirements of that. The extent to which you're creating public records, and those may be disclosed, the extent to which, as you gather and discuss the business, it may well trigger a public meeting, and that would have to have the proper notice and openness as you're moving forward. All right, so I'm going to pause there. I left a whopping 3 minutes for some questions, but I'm also glad to stay on the chat and answer additional questions as we go. So let me see if I'm happy for you to just raise your hand, take yourself off mute, or add questions to the chat, and I'll see what I can do.
And Adam, we also are a little bit ahead of schedule. You have 15 minutes for Q&A if questions arise.
I'm glad to fill it if we've got it. And I at the start, I thought I heard Karen say we were going to move on to the next session, but I'm good for whatever.
Okay. Yeah, we can have a little mini break too.
I do have one quick question. Related to cases. Now, the whole public meeting part is for any current active cases, but once something has been decided, there's no issues with discussing kind of like what happened to it because it doesn't have any impact on the case itself. Is that correct?
It's a great question. And this is going to be one of those where I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes and not answer your question. In general, yes, the greatest concern is we're talking about stuff before a hearing, before a case is decided, where there's backroom dealing and we're figuring it out. That's the worst case scenario. That's what we don't there are worst case scenarios, bribery and any number of other things. But we want to avoid the discussions ahead of time that are kind of deliberating and figuring something out. That said, after we've made a decision, that decision could be appealed. That decision could come back before us for some amendment or some change. That decision may be very similar to other future decisions, and the conversation might wander from, well, we made this decision last time, but we've got this case coming up. And so while there may be less concern, there are still important and legitimate concerns, I think, that would come up from discussing those things amongst yourselves or out with the media or with kind of the general public. And so I would be wary of having those conversations of kind of the Monday morning quarterbacking, for lack of a better, kind of the armchair discussions after the fact and ruminations about what could have been. I'd be careful with those. And you may well have guidance either in your rules of procedure or city policies, or there may be guidance from the city attorney's office on where those bounds would be and kind of what you should watch for.
Adam, if I could just jump in on that one too, I think that's it's a really good answer. And I think the thing that I would be concerned about is, we talk a lot at the board about precedents and trying to be consistent on all of our decisions that have been made. And so I think that fits right into exactly what you said, that as you're discussing something afterwards, that could be considered to be a precedent to be used for later decisions. And I think that becomes problematic because it is pretty meaningful.
Adam, you have a question on the chat as well. There's a question on the chat.
Got it. Thank you. Sorry,
That's okay.
I'm
multitasking for you.
No, I appreciate it. And my internet is unstable, it's telling me. So everyone froze. I was like, oh no, here we go. All right. So do you have a syllabus or reading list on these issues that you could share with us? So great question. I don't have, there is I think the National Trust put out, it's been several years ago now, but it's still good, good reading and good resource. The Layperson's Guide to Historic Preservation Law walks through many of the things that I went through today. It's not specific to Virginia law, but it gives that kind of breakdown of here's the different federal pieces, here's the way that local pieces play out, talks about a lot of the incentives. And so I really recommend that. And I'll see if I can track down a link for that and put it in the chat once I'm done talking. But that would be a good one. Some of the cases, the Penn Central case is an especially long Supreme Court case. It's got a lot of stuff that doesn't matter for historic preservation. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that unless you're just kind of a glutton for punishment and want to dig into 1970s jurisprudence. But it is an interesting read just with regard to kind of the way that it played out and some of the factors that come in. But I think that that National Trust publication, I'll see if I can track down a link for that, because I think that would be a good one as a starting point.
And I would just reiterate something that I put into the chat a little while ago. We are scheduling with the city attorney's office to do some specific training in June. So there'll be opportunity to follow up on very specific Alexandria type of discussions at that time too. So, and this is great. This will help to inform that discussion.
Okay, well, it looks like Lauren is ahead of us. She's put the link into the chat room. So the advantage of having 4 people as trainers, some of us can do some research while we're on there. Any other questions for Adam, either by just asking them or going into the chat room? Going once?
Actually, I have a quick question.
Great, thank you.
Adam, I was interested in sort of you had mentioned the case of the mayor who was kind of caught saying, "Oh, I'm emailing you on my personal computer, so this isn't going to be FOIA'd." My experience, and I'm one of the city archaeologists, so I'm sort of a real sidelight member involved with the BAR and things like that. But in my experience with the city, there have been occasions where I've been told by the city attorney's office to collect all the correspondence that I might have pertaining to some issue, and not the bar is in my history hasn't been with any of the bar projects. But what I've been amazed is that I am given the freedom to self-select my correspondence, and I try to do the best I can to come up with everything that might be pertinent to the case or the issue. But I always kind of just chuckle to myself, because if I had an inappropriate email or correspondence, I can simply just bury it. No one outside of myself is going through my correspondence. So that's always kind of led me to be confused about how FOIA and how the legal system works with that. So any comments on that?
Yeah, that's a great question and a tough issue, Garrett. There is some level of it's very similar to conflicts of interest. There's some level of self-reporting and requirement that we're trusting folks to be forthright about whether they're approaching a case without any conflict and kind of in an unbiased way, whether they're providing all the emails that that concern this topic. One of the things that I think is a protection and a risk for the risk takers that might not be producing those emails. We live in a electronic digital age. And if you sent that email, who knows where that email got forwarded to and wound up. If you wound up in litigation and there was discovery, it very well could come to light. And so, from oftentimes a FOIA request, it is the local government and the actors within the local government who are pulling together what they think is responsive to that document request. And if they fail to adhere to providing what's required, they are putting themselves at risk of violating that FOIA standard. And I would personally be very nervous to be like trusting whoever I sent that email to. I would much rather just go ahead and I wish I hadn't sent it, but I did, so it's going into the batch, rather than trusting that wherever it got sent to, it's not going to turn up at some point later. So yes, there is a personal responsibility that's a part of it, and in a digital age when there's a record of everything, it very likely could turn up down the road anyway.
Are there any more questions or comments? And if not, we're going to take about a 2-minute break. And thank you, Adam, very much for your presentation. And we'll let Michelle pull up her screen. And we will, like I said, take about a 2-minute break and begin the standards and guidelines discussion.
All right, Karen, can you see it?
I can see it.
Okay.
You're there.
Just checking. Let's see if I can get myself sore. All right. I don't want to record.
Okay, Michelle, it's all yours.
All righty. Hope everyone's back. Again, hard act to follow there when you follow an attorney, but I'm going to come from it from a different perspective, from a staff perspective. Just again, kind of as Adam did, who I am. My name is Michelle McCullough, and I work as staff for the city of Winston-Salem and Forsyth County. So we're kind of the city-county thing. And we have 3 districts here. 2 of them are museum quality, which, looking into the history of Alexandria, I think somewhat is similar in a lot of respects. But I've been in preservation now for 18 years here, so been doing this a long time. So, and again, I welcome any questions during the process. During the chat, I will rely on my fellow trainers to kind of help me. If there's questions, just scream them out at me and we can go from there. And I'm going to take a deep dive into one part of those rules and regulations Adams was talking about, is our standards or guidelines for the design review process. So when you already have a commission set up, we're going to dive into that. And when we're dealing with our local districts. I was really excited to hear Karen and Lauren's presentations earlier too. Karen did a great job at kind of going over the history of the preservation movement. And Lauren talked a little bit about integrity, and she brought up that word. And I hope all of you know exactly what she was talking about, but we're going to get to defining that a little bit more and talking a little bit about that during my presentation. Again, we're all sitting here because we have local historic districts. But how did that happen? How did that come to be? And again, you're going to hear a little bit of repetition, but we have these National Register nominations or our local district applications and nominations that discuss 2 things: significance and integrity. And that's what tells us why our districts are important. That's what allows us to nominate these things to being locally designated or listed on the National Register. From there, the federal government did a great thing, and they created this Secretary of the Interior standards. And we're going to talk about those. And I'm going to give you some big picture items today so that you kind of see, when you get down in the minutia of what you do at your meetings and stuff, where did all of this come from? How do we know from Adam that we're allowed to do it, but do we have any guidance on how to do it? And that's what these Secretary of Interior standards help us with. And the federal government was so great that they broke it down into 4 different preservation approaches. And we'll talk about those in a minute. From there, when we want to get more local, we'll go into our local ordinance. And this tells us what's reviewable. From there, we create our guidelines or standards. And this is to get real specific in the nitty-gritty about what's appropriate or inappropriate. We use the statements of significance, integrity to focus on those guidelines, specifically our character defining elements. So what are the important things we should be looking at in our guidelines, in these local districts, and what we should be regulating? And again, who makes those decisions? It's the lucky commission, the BAR that's out there to determine what's approvable and what's not approvable. So again, the standards and these approaches kind of go from preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. Preservation, kind of the highest level of retaining everything, down to reconstruction. And we're going to talk about that. Again, preservation it really is that leave it alone, leave it as it is, make as little changes so we keep the original fabric, the original windows, the brick. I mean, sometimes like in Drayton Hall, they don't even add electricity, or modern day restrooms. Again, it's really a leave me alone sort of scenario. And you really want to, it's to capture a moment in time in the beginning of a time for that building. There are some cases when you do see that they do add electricity, but it's very little. And it's sometimes just for code so that they can allow people to come in and see those. This picture I have up here is some slave cabins we have up here in Forsyth County. And again, we're trying to just let them tell their story as they were originally built. And preservation, it isn't what we deal with typically for local districts. It is really the purest preservation method and methodology. So again, leave me alone. Now, restoration is when you look and you want to stop a building or a district, and my examples here are from our Old Salem district here in Winston-Salem, and they stop it at a moment in time. I love this time period. So here in Winston and at Old Salem, our period of significance is 1766 to 1856. And that's what they decided in the 1950s. We're going to bring all the buildings back to that period. So on the left, you can see kind of that blurry kind of gray and white picture up at the top was what had happened to it by the 50s or 60s. And below it is the Mishk House as it is today, if you would come visit it. And that's what it looked like in that period of significance. So again, it's stopping a building or an area in time and saying we want to bring it back to that period. And again, in our local districts, there can be some restoration projects. There can be that one special building, but typically you don't take a whole district. That's Williamsburg, Old Salem, Strasburg, all those kind of areas. The rehabilitation approach, and I love my little lambs here at our Stauber farm, is really what we deal with at a local level with our districts and our landmark properties. And it is defined as the process of returning a property to a state of utility through repair or alteration, which makes it possible for efficient contemporary use. These buildings are meant to be used, to be lived in, to have businesses in. They're not meant to be a museum. They're meant to, like downtown Alexandria, they're meant to have people come and eat dinner in them or have an office or a flower shop, all that kind of thing. So this is where we have most of our local district guidelines and standards come from, is the rehabilitation standards. And again, these are just some more examples from here in Winston-Salem. And sometimes when we're dealing with these buildings and these districts, if we don't have the rehabilitation, the adaptive reuse, it's a use it or lose it. Even if a building is the most significant building in town, on the right side is our Reynolds headquarters. Yes, it kind of looks like the Empire State Building, and it was built by Shreves and Lamb, the same firm, and it was built before the one in New York. But when Reynolds decided to move out of that building in early 2000s, we almost lost the building a couple times because they couldn't find an owner. And if we would have been really strict, it is a landmark property to us. If we would have been really strict and saying, nope, you can only come in and keep everything the same, we might have lost the building. So we didn't want that to happen. So it was allowed to be rehabilitated, adaptively reused. It's not offices anymore. It's got a hotel and it's got some condos in it. So the rehabilitation guidelines and our local guidelines allow for use. It allows for people to live there, especially if it's a residential house. People have to live in these homes. The last approach, and again, this is one you don't see very often because it's reconstruction. So it's usually in one of those districts like Williamsburg or Old Salem where they do have a museum element to a district. And it's what it is they've looked at an area, they've lost a building, and they want to bring that back to kind of fill in a gap, like I say, an empty tooth in the smile, so that people, when they come to visit that place, I get an idea. On our left here, we have our Single Brothers house, which was very critical in the Moravian culture in Old Salem. And on the right, you have the first settlers cabin that these Moravians lived in when they came here from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And that was recreated in Bethabara here in Winston-Salem. And again, I'm inviting everybody to come visit us. But a lot of times reconstructions, can you tell the difference? Which one was reconstructed? So I kind of wanted to see if everybody in their chat can let me know, which one do you think was built first, the first house or the fourth house? I'm going to give you a minute, but I want to see if you can guess. I want to see if I can see the chat from here. I'm trying to, here we go.
Someone said fourth. Two people, Stephanie Sample and Christine Sanat said fourth, and Tony Lasala. I'm sorry, everyone's saying fourth. Bill said first.
All right, well, guess what? The first house is the reconstruction. It was originally from 1766 and they reconstructed it in 1969. The fourth house was built in 1768 and they just restored it in 1966. So see, sometimes you get faked by those reconstructions. But it fills in that tooth. These houses are all along, the first through fifth house are all along right beside each other in Old Salem. So those are our 4 approaches that were given down from the National Park Service with the Secretary of the Interior standards. And with each one of those approaches, they give us a 10 commandments. And it's kind of like the best practices. And these 10 commandments are what we base our guidelines and our standards on. And it's the standards for the rehabilitation, again, that most of us focus our guidelines on. So this is what it looks like. If you've never been to the website and you're like, oh, I didn't realize that's what our guidelines are based on. The feds have done a great job. They have the list of the 10 commandments, but they also have a very in detailed kind of document that goes over and it's recommend and do not recommend, anywhere from windows to doors to all that kind of thing. And again, when you're doing guidelines, especially if you're a new commission, that's the first place you go. Now, Alexandria, you've had a set of guidelines since 1993, I think was your last update. So you've looked at these. These have been around. They were around when you did that. So we're going to go through these just to show you the basics and what really are the 10 commandments behind what we do at a local level. And then we're going to get a little bit in the weeds, as I'm going to say, is because we talked to staff and you may be doing a guideline update. So I want to give you some things to think about if you do look at your guidelines in the future. From our experience, we just updated a set of ours. So our 10 commandments for the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. The first one is the property shall be used for its historic purpose or be placed in a use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building and its site and environment. Typically in local districts, we don't deal a lot with use. We are just dealing with changes made to the exterior of the building and the site. However, sometimes when they make changes because of the use, it's important to those changes. So it's good to encourage when we have a building to try to be used. So if it's a church, you want it to be a church. But if it can't be a church or it can't be a depot, what's a good use that has very little change into it? So at the top was a church that they have a farmer's market in it every Sunday and Saturday. So big open room, people still get to use it. People still get to keep the elements of the church that are important. The second standard, the historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved. This is very important to our commissions. The removal of historic material or alterations, features, and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided. I mean, this is why we have guidelines, because we need to help people understand what do they do when they do need to make changes and what are appropriate. So, top picture here, beautiful fan light in the top. This is one of those occasions, if you get an application to put this kind of window to replace it, this is an inappropriate replacement for that window. Let's say a tree fell in on it and it busted it. It really needed to be replaced. This is not what we want to see in the bottom picture. What you want to see is they want them to retain that. And if they were going to have to replace it, to make it look like the top picture. And again, you want to keep those character defining features. And we're going to talk more about those too. Again, they discourage concealing features too. That's when you're putting on siding over wood. Again, when you put something on top of something, you don't know what's going on underneath. There could be deterioration happening that's actually damaging that original material, and you would never know and never see it, and you're losing it. And you also just don't want to remove historic material if you don't need to. The third one is always a challenging one. Whenever I've done this talk, people sometimes go, because it's a hard one. And I actually found a great example in Alexandria that I'm going to share with you. But each property shall be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historic development, such as adding conjectural features or architectural elements from the building, shall not be undertaken. So the top building was a church building. You entered actually through the front, the little gabled front, and it was a very simple building. It was purchased. And as you can see in the bottom, somebody made it their house. That's a great adaptive reuse. We didn't lose the building, but look at all the features they added to that poor little building. They've now made the front entrance on the side. It looks like it was made in the Victorian age. It's got all these Victorian features added. You've created a false sense of historic development in that. And so what you really are trying to do in your local designated districts and properties, you want their history to be seen and shown, especially when you make changes to that. When I was researching Alexandria, I found an interesting article about fencing and about in your Parker Gray district. And somebody wanted to remove chain link fence and put up the nice fence on the right side, but the chain link had been original. So putting in the fence on the right changes the character and gives it a false sense of history. So I thought that was a very interesting case of not how a building had changed, but how you can even make these sort of changes in your environment. And again, I think this is probably a hot topic for you guys too, because you would think that fence on the right, that looks nice, doesn't it? Because that's what you hear. It looks nice. I like it better. We've got to be careful. And we're going to talk next week about terms to use when you're in a meeting and stuff. But is that really appropriate? The fourth standard, most properties change over time. And some of those changes can acquire their own historic significance, and they can be retained and preserved, and they now become part of the story for that building. I love this, the building to the right, you see the front part of the building with the two towers, that was the original building. At some time, they added the huge center square addition part of the building, and it was done over 50 years ago. So it has now become part of the history of that building and important to it. So you want to retain those sort of additions to buildings over time because they help to tell the story. Again, this one's kind of a no-brainer. Distinctive features, construction techniques, craftsmanship that characterize a historic building shall be preserved. I always say the pretties of the building, that's what we're here for, is to retain those. We don't want to see them covered. You don't want to see them removed. You don't want to see them damaged when you're putting on an addition or anything. Doesn't mean you can't put on an addition, but these are the features as a commission you're watching out for. So, and that this one probably is one of those ones you see a lot of cases where sometimes these are the hard cases. You want to add something, but you don't want to lose anything from the historic building. The sixth standard is deteriorated historic features shall be repaired rather than replaced. Again, big standard for us in local districts. So what you want to try to do is if you've got a wood shingle roof, you want to try to keep a wood shingle roof. You want to repair the shingles that need to be replaced, not do wholesale replacement if it's not required. Now, if it is so deteriorated that it does require wholesale replacement, you want to make sure that the new feature matches the old in design, color, texture, and other visible qualities where possible materials. So that, let's say you had one of those crazy products that was made in the 30s and 40s, Zenotherm or something, they don't make it anymore. You have to find a replacement material. So what you want to do is make sure the elements of that material match what the old material was. Again, this is probably reflected, this national standard, in your guidelines. When you're making replacement of missing features, so say over time, it lost its exterior gable. What you want to try to do is find some sort of documentation of what it actually looked like in the beginning when it was first built. A lot of times pictures, you may luck out, and when they were doing the nomination for the district, they may have found those and put those in the file, but you may need to do some digging. If you don't find those sort of things, what you do is you try to look at the district itself and get examples from the same time period. And that's kind of your best frame of reference when you have to find that. But again, this is one of those big national standards that helps tell us what our guidelines should be telling us for our districts. This one, number 7, chemical or physical treatments such as sandblasting that cause damage to historic materials shall not be used. The surface cleaning and structures, if appropriate, shall be taken under the gentlest means possible. So if you're lucky and you get an application that comes in before it's done any work and they put something in about how they're going to clean it and they say sandblasting, you get an opportunity to say, whoa, 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 you don't want to really do that because that could really cause damage to your building. Here's what you should do. And again, the national standards help us, with that a lot too, because there's a great guide out there. 8 is actually looking at our archaeology, and I know there's some archaeologists on here. Significant archaeological resources affected by a project shall be protected and preserved. If such resources must be disturbed, mitigation measures shall be undertaken. So again, if you have a great area that in Old Salem, anytime any work is done there, we have to put a clause in about make sure if you run into something underground, you got to stop and you got to see if it's new information that we've never found before. I'm sure Alexandria, since you have roads and all of these sort of new things, a lot of times the dirt has already been taken up. But let's say there's a house that act of God took a house and they want to build a new house and they want to put a basement where there wasn't one. You want to make sure that you know that you've got an archaeologist on site sometimes to say, hey, we might find some new information about this area we didn't know before. So always consider archaeology. Sometimes we're so consumed with looking at the built environment, we forget about what's underground. Number 9 deals with our new additions and exterior alterations. So new construction, it shall not destroy historic material that characterizes the property. The new work shall be differentiated from the old and shall be compatible with the massing, size, scale, and architectural features to protect the historic integrity of the property and the environment. So our examples are showing you, the top one kind of shows you when they wanted to put a new addition on, it's that how do you differentiate the old building on the left from the new building on the right? It was really popular, 70s, 80s, 90s, just make it out of glass, a glass enclosure. There are tons of great examples out there now how to do this, especially in our bigger cities like Boston, New York, and those places. So if you have a building and they want to make this huge, massive addition, take a look out there, and get a hold of it. NAPC is a great reference because we've got guidelines from all over the place, great references to go out there about how to do this and how to do it right. The bottom example is just adding a little addition to the building. And you can see it actually looks at the old building and says, okay, I want to be like the old design, but I want to kind of give reverence to it. It doesn't try to overdo the historic building, but it gives them a little more space and it's differentiated. You know that that's not part of the original structure. And number 10 is new additions and adjacent or related new construction shall be undertaken in such a manner that if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic building and its environment will be unimpaired. So basically, if you build an addition, what you want to do is that have it in a location, number 1, that's not highly visible, but that also, say you wanted to remove that addition, it would cause little effect to that house. You could put the 2 windows or the doors back on the top example here. And the bottom one, the addition is in the rear. It's that small 1-story gable. You could remove that addition and bring back that historic house and no one would know. So that's what you want to do. You're showing respect and reverence to that historic structure. So those are the 10 commandments under rehabilitation. In the basic practices, we got to remember, and that are probably in all guidelines, are repair rather than replace and match design with color, texture, and visual qualities and materials if possible. And when you have to add a missing feature, make sure you get some documentation or you make it an educated approach to doing that. I think I've been seeing some things in chat, but I don't know how to get to them. Here we go. Does anybody have any questions at this time before I go on to updating guidelines?
It looks like a lot of it has been comments.
Okay.
And Karen can probably look through these and see if any questions came out once you're at the very end of your presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Michelle, why don't you continue on? I think there's some good points in here and some experts, some subject matter experts within this group. So why don't we wait until you're completed and we can have a more open discussion.
Okay, just wanted to touch base because I'm gonna transition. So again, the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation are basically what our guidelines should be based on. When I was researching Alexandria, I noticed you've got guidelines in your ordinances, you've got guidelines, you actually have a guideline book from 93, and then you have updated some of them in time, and you have like a one-page sheet on like windows, gas meters, things like that. So, and we talked to staff and they said, you know, it may be coming time for us to do some sort of guideline update. And here in Winston-Salem, we just finished updating a set of guidelines and we're getting ready to update our old Salem guidelines. And so I thought what I would do is kind of go over some things we learned from this, the process we just finished, and give you some ideas or just things to think about if you do go through with this updating your guidelines, so that you don't do it cold. And one of the biggest things, if I don't remember to say at the end, there are other people out there to call on. And again, NAPC is a great group because Marie can always tell you, hey, we've got some great guidelines. They're online. Go look at them here. But there's always staff that you can call and talk to. So reach out, you know, when you're doing this and get information from others who have already just gone through it or are going to go through it. And again, with COVID, we've all learned a lot of things about how to do things and how to do things differently. So I would just highly suggest before you start, reach out to other groups. So let me keep going here. For some reason, I am frozen. Let me see here. There we go. So again, I'm going to give you some things to think about here if you begin a guideline update process. So what are we updating? And as I said, when I looked at yours, and I'm sorry about the quality because I was trying to grab things and they just came across blurry when I made them bigger, but you're wanting to update your guidelines themselves. So if you have a guideline book, if you have guidelines in your ordinance, make sure you review those. And then any updates that you have made that are like one pagers, like your window and things. So you're updating your guidelines as a whole. I'm big into the who, what, where, when, and why, because I think if you answer these questions, you cover everything. So where, you guys have two districts. You have your Alexandria, old and historic Alexandria districts and your Parker Gray districts. So I would, if you're going to do a guideline update and you have one set of guidelines for those districts, update them both. If you have two sets of guidelines, one for each, you may want to consider doing two different processes. So you really focus in on these two districts because they are different. They have different character defining features in some cases. Why would you want to do this? And I probably should have started with this one, but the function of a guideline is to enable stewards of the resources to understand the community's preservation policies. In basic terms, guidelines are to take that Adam Lovelady language he was talking about and everything he talked about and to put it into Michelle McCullough terms. I always tell people as staff, I am your building's best friend, not your best friend. And I have this set of guidelines that's going to help communicate to you everything that we want to see. So those guidelines are the user-friendly way that if I move into your historic districts, I know what I can and can't do to my house. My expectations are put right down there in paper. So if I move in here and have those guidelines in front of me and I say, but I want to replace all my windows, I should know better. This might not be the neighborhood for me, but it's your user-friendly set of guidelines. How to update a set of guidelines. And I'm going to spend a couple minutes here because this question and how you do the process is very important because there's going to be two parts of it. Who does it, who actually does it, and how you get information then from everybody you should. So we're going to talk about those elements. So I'm going to go over some options for how. One is your BAR, with the help of staff, of course, does it themselves. You start out, you have the little community committee. You either have a committee of your BAR or the whole group. Remember, you've got to watch for when you need to make it a public meeting. So if you have more than a quorum there, you're going to have it as a public meeting, but you do all the hard work. I will tell you, you will be involved as a BAR and your staff will be involved. This may not be the way you want to do it though, because it's a lot of work. Staff can do it all by itself, but this is what your staff's going to look like if they do all by themselves. It's a lot of work to update a set of guidelines at a staff level, plus continue doing your job, the monthly meetings and all that. So I would say, don't lay it all on your staff. We started out doing that with our last set of guidelines, and we quickly determined that's not going to be the way that we can do it. By committee. So by committee, it can have some BAR people on it, but it may also have some residents, some business owners, all of that sort of thing. This can be a great option, or it can turn into a not so great option. There are pros and cons, again, to each one of these. What I would recommend, if you do it by committee, you make it very known, you get active people involved, but you get people from all sorts of the district. You get a lot of residents, but you don't just get the residents that come to every meeting. You need to get those residents you don't hear from sometimes, because you've got to make sure you have the right representation on your committees. So it's very important to make sure you get the right people on the committee. Or you can hire a consultant. And this, to me, is the easy way out. And it's a great way if you can do it, if you have the money to do it. And then you have a document that a consultant does. They do all the hard work. It takes the pressure off your staff and your BAR, but it gives you something to react to from the outside person. A lot of times, though, we can't afford that. So in the end, what I would recommend is some sort of hybrid of the BAR having a committee and working with the residents. And who should they work with? Who uses the guidelines? Property owners, applicants. And when I say applicants, you may say, isn't that the property owner? No, sometimes you have the architects, sometimes you have landscape architects, sometimes you even have the contractor. Commissioners, commission staff, city councils and appeals. You don't want a city council person on your committee, but make sure you realize that they are going to be looking at these guidelines, because if they have to hear your appeals, they have to understand what's going on, and contractors and the like. So those are the kind of people you want to look for to be on your committees, but those are also the kind of people you want to keep in mind when you're doing these updates. So you figured out, Michelle, we're going to do some sort of variation. We're going to have a committee. First thing you need to do is collect some information now. Why are you updating them? Well, because you want one set of good, understandable, user-friendly documents, but you also want to address issues and things that are unclear. So how do you find out what's unclear? We reviewed our meeting minutes and we went back and, we kept track over the last, it had been 10 years since we updated guidelines. And there were some issues that kept coming up that, man, we really didn't address. I'm trying to think of, we really didn't address people wanting to make changes to garages. Are they allowed to make changes to garages? Can they add a second story to a garage? What is appropriate in your district? So that's one example. So you need to find out what are issues. But we also had people who lived in the neighborhood, never came to meetings. They do their certificates of appropriateness. They'd ask for permission, but they always said, I have children. I have a dog. I need to have a fence. These guidelines don't allow me to do some of the things that I need to do to live in this building, or I need to have an office. I have to have new wiring come in so we can have this internet. How do I put that on my building correctly? It's not addressed in your guidelines. So how do you collect this information? And the one thing that COVID's done is taught us all to be very creative. There's always good surveys you can do online and have on your website. And again, this is working with staff, and people can input it at any time. They don't have to come to a 4 o'clock or a 2 o'clock meeting or a 7 o'clock at night meeting. They can go online and say, hey, here are my issues. You can have meetings, presentation meetings where you have a talking head like me standing there telling you blah, 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 and then people can feed back. Or you have drop-in sessions where you just have staff at a table and you have your guidelines in front of you. And you're saying, hey, what issues do you have? What do you like about our guidelines? What do you not? What do you feel, needs to be changed? We need to address. At these meetings, you could have boards with topics, likes and dislikes. And I'll show you an example. We did that at ours and it really worked out well. Social media has become a great way to interact with people. If it's not just to let people know about these drop-in meetings or topics or the online surveys, make sure you utilize that, because some people are always on their Facebook account or their Instagram account. If they don't see anything else, they see Instagram. And again, be creative. So here on the left, this was one of our drop-in sessions, and we had topics that were hot topics, like new signage in our area. So we had boards with examples, and we gave them colored. Which ones do you like and not like? Which ones do you feel are appropriate, not appropriate? And it was very interesting. And the great thing about it is we held this one at a public library. We held all our meetings at public spaces, these drop-in meetings, and this was pre-COVID, I will tell you that. So that's why you don't see any masks or anything. but people could come, people we'd never seen before at our meetings and say, thank you so much for allowing me to have a voice. I could come to this because we dropped in from 12 to 3 and then had another session from 7 to 9. So if you work days or nights, we made sure we had times and places everybody could attend. Up in the top right-hand corner, Charlotte had this is during COVID, they had a meeting at a drive-in theater and getting input. And again, they had a talking head, but they allowed input, had to be creative. On the bottom, this is again during COVID, people out there outside so that we aren't spreading germs. But again, be creative, and you don't have to do everything just one way. You could do all 3 of these ideas. You could have 10 more. The more information you collect, the better. The one thing I advise you is make sure you're honest that we're collecting input. It doesn't mean we're going to use everybody's input, but we're collecting it, because in the end, the guidelines have to be about the historic buildings. One of the biggest things, I think we all think, okay, we'll get through this project, create a timeline, and that's going to be the BAR and staff, and stick to it. If you have to amend it, like a pandemic happens, amend it, but then stick to it, because you don't want your process to drag out forever and years and years. Ours took 5 years, and it took way too long, and we let things get in the way and didn't stick to our timeline. So that's why I wanted to make sure, stick to it, because people will be watching. And if you don't keep your promise about, we're going to get this done, their properties are on the line. They know that these changes could make, changes for their property. I'm going to go just briefly over like what should be included. Again, when you do an update, have some sort of mission statement. Include why you're updating now. Why now? What's your goal? Be clear, be short, use language everybody can use. Don't try to use too much preservationese, legalese, planningese. Just tell people what you're doing and why. You're going to have topics in your guidelines, and I was very impressed with your guidelines. For them being done in 1993, you guys hit on topics that you thought ahead, and it was very impressive. First and foremost, we're going to have guidelines about the building. And again, those repair rather than remove, and all of those sort of things. So that those are the no-brainers. What you'll find yourself dealing with in a guideline update are the things that are always changing. Technology, energy efficiency. We had to deal with, think about automobiles. We're now having electric cars. So people want to have electric car stations at their house to charge them. You got to try to think a little bit ahead, but none of us can predict everything in the future, but just do the best you can to go through all of these hot topics, because that's where you're going to have the most tension. And that's what people are going to be wanting to know. What'll I do? If it's not mentioned at all, do you even get to say what they can do? And then talk about new construction, relocation, demolition. Those are topics that are going to be in there you have to deal with. A couple more things to keep in mind, and I'm trying to make sure my time is good. I talked a little bit about the character defining features. Those are just the elements of the building in the district that are important, that are historic. Those are the things that are making each building important for what they are. Those are the doodads, the pretties, as I call them, the columns, the windows. Sometimes a building can be very simple, and it really is its window pattern, the 6/6 windows. Those are the most important things, and those are the things in your guidelines you want to make sure you're retaining and preserving. Again, lots of great character defining features in Alexandria. But it's also in a district, there can be other features: gates, fences, walkways, signage, lighting. And again, you have current guidelines on all these. And again, your guidelines are great, but think for the future. How will people want changed? What happens if our automobiles get bigger, smaller? Again, do we need, charging stations? Do we need to have electric portals for more cords to come into buildings? All that kind of stuff. How do we protect what's historic, but also allow people to live and keep producing in a modern day? There are also going to be some other type of things that you have to discuss. You guys had to discuss gas meters because your buildings are so close together. Where do you put new ones when you want to put them? How do you do screening of them? Do you allow awnings? Do you allow gates and fences on the street? Modern facilities like gas stations. And again, and I pulled all these right from your current guidelines, but they're things, it's the things like these that you've got to keep considering, especially in a guideline update. Make sure when you're writing it, again, remember that audience, you don't want it to be this document that I, as a homeowner, if I buy a property, a business owner, that I can't understand it. You want them to be able to use it. So make the writing simple and understandable. Have good graphics, drawings, illustrations. Make sure they're labeled. Do you use photos? I will tell you, I would have said, yes, use photos. Well, that same guidelines we just updated, I had updated it at the very beginning of my career in Winston-Salem, and we used tons of photos in it. Guess what happened? We learned when people brought in cases, approvals, they would actually look at photos in different sections and say, look, you allowed a gate in this. Look, this picture shows a gate that I want to do, but that's not what we were trying to show. So you've got to make sure your photos show what you wanted to show and don't have anything wrong in the background, because somebody's going to pick up on that. Use your glossary for more than just architectural terms. In the old days, we used to have these huge glossaries that would tell you, what a gable is, what this is, what that is, but also use terms like feasibility, anything that you think somebody that's new, that's never dived into the historic district world before, what do they need to know? It's a great place for you to define terms. In every section, or at least in some place, give yourself a catch-all, a wiggle room. So if something does come up, all of a sudden we're putting in doggy houses that are the size of garages, that you can make a decision on those as the BAR, because you need to be able to have something to make a decision on. If it's not in there, sometimes it's hard. How do we make a motion to make a decision? So again, we made sure in each section, we had the last guideline was a catch-all. If this topic is not covered, if your work is not covered in this set of guidelines, they will do this. Maybe you'll refer back to that Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. Those are always good to include because they, again, are the Bible, the 10 Commandments. Once you have a document, once you have a draft, you put it together in whatever way, a consultant, your staff, however you've done it, review it, review it, review it. Make sure you've got as clear of a document as you can, and you've covered as much as you can. Edit it, edit it, edit it. Make sure you're using language that people understand. Have some cold readers read it. People that aren't in the preservation world. Is there a question that comes up from something you've said that you're so involved in it, you don't even see it? People from other preservation districts that may not be local districts, but they understand your terminology. And again, the NAPC is a great resource. There are people like all of us today that are presenting to you. We're here to help you. And there's a whole mass group of speakers and stuff, trainers, that we would love to help you. So, call on the professionals out there to help you go through a document before you put it out. Once you put it out, you got to collect that input again. So you may use some of the same things. You may go back out and do the same techniques you used before to get their input on this final document. And then to say, okay, it makes sense. You may find out something you thought was clear as day is as clear as mud. So that's why it's important to get feedback again and then go through your approval process. So again, today I just kind of wanted to highlight, if you go about that process to update your guidelines, here's some things to think about. More than happy to answer any questions and give you that basis of the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation, that's really the go-to resource when you do things, and that's what everything's based on. So
I actually have a question related to that. So there was a good quote that was put into the chat about, how the guidelines have evolved over time and how in some ways they become more strict and less lenient. And my question really is I know that those are the basis of our standards, but I guess this may go back to the legal piece of it, is that how much are we required to use those as the basis and to follow those, or can we deviate from them and say, well, you know, based off of modern times and based off of our, you know, city and our current status and what, you know, we believe is important to preserve and how to do it, we can deviate from those, you know, Secretary of Interior standards. And the one that I point out the most actually is number 6, which is, you know, to replace in kind. And we had a couple chats about that because we've had a lot of discussions about that, about creating a false sense of history, and you know, making something look old that's not old, or making something look original that's not original. And how do we, you know, and I know that we have guidelines in terms of differentiating like additions and things like that. You know, and like when I did my own edition, I made it brick and I made it the same color, but it was a different texture. So from far away it fits in, but when you go up close, you can see that it's obviously modern and different. And so, you know, I think that's really my question is when we deviate from what those Secretary of the Interior standards are, I guess, are there any legal ramifications to that?
So I'm going to jump in, Michelle. John Richards had posted something. If you scroll to your chat at 8:32 a.m., it was a quote from Brown Morton about the evolution of the standards, and that's what Purvi's referring to. So I just wanted to let you have a minute to take a look at that since you were presenting when it was put in the chat box.
Well, and as I said, the great thing to do is go look at their website, because they do have this recommend, not recommend. Now I'm going to give you an answer. And Adam, feel free to jump in here, because there's a little bit of a legal question there, I heard. The thing you do is you look at your ordinance and you look at what you're required to do, what you're allowed to do. And that's what's put in your ordinance and your state statute and that sort of thing. I know here in North Carolina, what it says is you have a commission and you're required to have this set of guidelines, and the guidelines are created through this process. It does not tell us we have to legally go back to the Secretary of Interior standards. This is what I see as best practices. The feds did this for us to kind of help us. Has times evolved? Yes, I think they have. And I think each locale gets to look at that and say, what's the best for our historic district, and how do we interpret that to keep the historic nature, but also to allow people to live in these buildings and to use these buildings? Adam, did I just say something wrong?
No, I agree completely. I was just going to add on, mainly because you called my name. Otherwise, I would have just stayed silent. There's the policy question for each community to take on of how strict do we want to be? What is the, do we want to regulate color or not? Do we want to allow for modern materials or not? And what are the important pieces to us? And that's outlined in your ordinance. It's outlined in your design guidelines, and it may be restrained or limited by the state authority, but it's a local decision.
Yeah.
But the big legal piece is a property owner within your district needs to have clear guiding standards about what's expected of them. They need to know, okay, here's what I've got to do. So let me put together my application. Let me hire the architect that's going to design my project in a way that meets those standards. Now, sure, there's still some judgment and discretion involved about what's appropriate, but there should be some clear guiding standards so that folks know, am I meeting that standard or not? What it cannot be, and what I will spend an hour talking about next week, it can't be, well, the applicant shows up and we just kind of do a gut feeling. Well, do we like this or not? Does this feel right? We need to not be operating from that starting point. We need to be operating from the starting point of, what does the ordinance call for? What do the design guidelines call for? And does this project meet those standards? If it does, then we should be approving the project. If it doesn't, we should be denying it. And there's the hard calls in between. That's the reason that you have a board with expertise. but we can't be kind of just a board that's the pretty police. That's like, do we like this or not? Does it feel right? If we don't like the standards, if we think the standards and design guidelines ought to change, then we need to go through the process of doing that, of changing those standards. And it sounds like you've got an opportunity for that coming up.
And like I said,
can
substitute
jump in,
material
too.
is always a big question. And it's definitely something then, if you see that, again, like I said, sometimes wood shingles, there's an insurance issue, there's this issue. Maybe that isn't the most significant feature. So then you do allow for substitute materials, but you have to address it in those guidelines. You know, you have to let people know what to expect. And that's the biggest thing. That's why I say, when you review your guidelines, make sure you review them through the light of, pretend you're the new homeowner and make every change you can possibly think of, and make sure it's addressed in those guidelines. I'm sorry, sir, you go ahead.
No, Michelle, thank you. I just wanted to jump in. I agree completely with everything you and Adam said, but I wanted to let Purvi know that when we were writing the design guidelines back in 91 to 93, we had a very large community committee, and they specifically said, we've been a historic district since 1946. We already have a tradition. We don't want the glass box to differentiate itself from the historic 18th century house. We want a subtle differentiation, but there were enough of those little differentiations. Some communities at that time were wholesale adopting the Secretary of the Interior standards as their design guidelines. And that's what Brown Morton was referencing in the quote that John had put up. That wasn't what they were intended to be, and they aren't clear enough and don't vary enough by each unique community and each case. Now, we can't be arbitrary and capricious like Adam is talking about, but we have 75 years of tradition that we've built on, and I don't think we're going to be throwing out the baby with the bathwater when we amend and update our design guidelines. There was a very specific direction from the community. No, we don't want staff to use the Secretary's standards, but yes, our design guidelines do in fact comply with the Secretary's standards.
Right. Again, that's why I like when they did the top 10, the 10 commandments. That doesn't tell you what to do in every situation. It gives you this highbrow helicopter look over it, but your guidelines are feet on the ground, on your ground, and everybody's are going to be different. So that's why you can look at Boston's and New York and Winston-Salem's and Raleigh's. You can look at all these great cities, but yours are going to be different, you know? And again, as I said, I was very impressed when I looked at yours, but what I found that I think you guys need, one of the goals would be is to get one document that has everything in it now. You've done some updates, you've got some stuff in your ordinance. So one document, so when I'm a new homeowner, you just have to give them that one piece. If you tell them to look in 3 or 4 different places, you lose people because they're like, this is too much trouble. No, it's not, you know, but so if you have that one document, it's great. And so, you know, you may just be repackaging a lot, and that's okay. That's okay. Repackaging and expressing what it means. That's what those guidelines are for. That's the most important thing. So.
Can I just add too about the Secretary of Interior standards? What's also important, and I need to go back and look, but it's also including the preservation briefs as well as part of your standards, because you know, a lot of commissions just adopt the guidelines, and so much of what we rely on are the briefs, which really have evolved over a period of time, and they address some of the issues that come up, like gas meters or electric charging stations. I mean, they haven't done that yet, but that's the kind of thing. So it's really important to, if you haven't already, to adopt those as part of your guidelines and standards. And I say that from the very rich experience of like 15 years ago, when we had been relying on that, but had only adopted the standards in conjunction with local guidelines. And, you know, someone appealed the decision where we had relied on the brief, and we had to go back and adopt the briefs as well as part of our guidelines. So if you're using those in your everyday decision-making, both at the staff level and the commission level, it's really important to adopt those as well. And I think we've come, to the end of our time. If there are any other questions,
Could I
speak
add
now.
One thing,
Yes,
because I've seen a couple
absolutely.
people say, talking about the finances, and again, Adam, chirp in here, but a lot of us always say, we can't consider money. We can't consider this. There's other ways to review, again, in guidelines, like I was saying, when you look at substitute material, well, when are you allowed to use substitute material? That's going to be a very important piece of your guidelines. When is it feasible to maintain the historic and keep a slate roof, or can I replace it? You just need to be very clear. And again, that's going to be the discussion you're going to be having when you have your public meetings and your talking sessions and your collecting of information. And I'm so glad you brought up the briefs. I couldn't remember the word brief, and that's why I didn't get it. But those are also a great resource. Go see. I mean, we're always learning. The feds are learning. We're always learning. So look for those things like that. So
Something to think about.
if you have districts that are, I'm going to use the word lower income, working class, you may want to make your guidelines less stringent on some topics. You may not have to put the slate back on, but here's what's appropriate then. We want architectural asphalt shingle, not just any day. You know, you can have a composite window instead of having to buy a wood window, that sort of thing. But just be clear so people know when they move in there what to expect. Lauren, I'm sorry.
To think about too, just as a aside, is how technology is changing materials. So we used to say, you know, no, nothing but wood, but now fiberglass clad is just as good, aluminum clad. New wood windows actually don't last as long as old wood windows because they're not old growth. Sorry, kids again.
Yeah, she's correct. So that's stuff to consider. Sometimes being you have to use isn't always the right approach. So again, but in your guidelines, you can take that stuff into consideration. So.
Thank you very much, Michelle. We have just a few more minutes. I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to do first for the next session, which is next Thursday from 4 to 7, your time. Lauren and I a little earlier. Adam is going to discuss due process and decision making. So those are some of the more practical issues that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Michelle is going to come back and talk about the role of commission and staff. And Lauren is going to present more about public outreach and community engagement. But before we get there, we have an exercise that we would like you to do that we will all compile the information and discuss at the end of the meeting on next Thursday. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to bring my presentation up. Maybe.
Let me know if you need my tech support, Karen.
Well, it's looking like that.
Okay, just make sure you have PowerPoint up.
Yeah, now I have the PowerPoint up.
And come back to Zoom and then share your screen. Click on the PowerPoint.
Right. No, I'm getting there.
And while you're doing that, I'm just going to mention that what Karen is about to talk about. So it's a very quick homework assignment, and it's going to be a little survey. I'm going to post the link to it in the chat, and I'm also going to send it in a follow-up email. So be on the lookout for that. I'm going to post it right now.
Yeah. Marie, could you give me, I've got it up, but oh, here I got it. I think I got it. Nope. So. Okay. We are going to do a SWOT analysis. Have folks been used that before? So SWOT is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And I think we have talked a little bit today, at least from our perspective as the trainers, that we think you all have really great guidelines and infrastructure in the city of Alexandria. It's something we all talked about just internally as something that has really impressed us. I know they were done in 1993, and I know we've talked about updates, and that might be an opportunity. But that is one thing that we have identified. And what we'd really like you to do is identify from your perspective some of the strengths of your program, of your commission, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on next Thursday. Weaknesses. I've looked at some of the comments. We had some commentary about elected officials still not getting it. And so it seems to me that there might be some room there in terms of, trying to come up with some strategies to assist those people in speaking more intelligently about the program. I know how challenging that can be with elected officials, but it's still a marketing issue for you. I have tried all through every stock photo on the internet to find something that said opportunities only, but my only choices were job opportunities or equal opportunities. So I went with great opportunities. So we're gonna take a look at that in terms of the SWOT analysis. But going back to the last discussion, just in terms of dealing with elected officials or even any members of the public, business community, even members, residents, owners in historic districts, what are the opportunities to make everything that you're doing more understandable? I think we talked just a few minutes ago in terms of, how the guidelines are formatted and how they're available, some of the pros and cons of using photos. I totally agree with Michelle. We used to have people that came in, even with the ordinance, and it says, well, it says right here. And it was like, well, that's a totally different section. You just can't cherry pick everything. So, what are the opportunities you see? Because that's really what we want to lead with as a result of this training. And finally, are there any threats that you perceive? And what are they? And we can address them. Hopefully that will come out in the opportunities. So as Marie said, she has put the poll in, and we can also email it to the participants. And we'd like you to get that information in by the 17th. You don't have to have 20 things in each column. If you can't think of a threat, you don't need to put a threat in. It's not a test. It's not anything we're going to attribute to you, but we will take that information and have a discussion about what you all collectively have identified at the end of our conversation next Thursday. So are there any questions about that? None?
This has been really great.
Okay, well, great. And I think, you had, I think initially talked a little bit about Privy, how to convey that information. I'm trying to get back up to the quote. But I think that trying to hear from you all what you consider the issues to be is really the best way to move forward for your commission. And we, of course, have some ideas, but we want you to generate them too. And we'll put ours in there as well, in terms of suggestions. So is the 17th a reasonable amount of time? Again, I'm not talking writing a thesis proposal. It's basically, one or two things in each category. And if you don't have something in a category, that's okay too. And it will be in the chat function, and we'll also send it out as an email. It'll be very simple in SurveyMonkey. And then I will work with the other trainers before we meet again to put it all together. So if there are any other questions, pop up now, or we can sign off, and we'll see you again next Thursday at 4 p.m. your time. Yes, no? Okay. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. It's been great.